about how he had liked games ever since he was young. He had always been in the hospital, so naturally he was always playing games. Games became a major part of his life. He played the game with intense concentration, his eyes glued to the screen. He was completely lost in the digital world. The game flashed "Game Over" on the screen, and he got annoyed. He shouted, asking how the AI could be so stupid and why it would heal the enemy instead. He realized that it's a given that you'll grow tired of something if you do it for too long. Even games can lose their appeal. He was done. He said screw this and threw the game onto the table in frustration. He thought that one day playing games just wasn't as fun as it used to be. He remembered playing all types of games, including AOS, RPG, and FPS. It didn't matter what kind of game he played, he thought. The thing is, every game that came out each year was completely garbage, he thought to himself. He thought that the story and world building were all similar and stereotypical. He felt like they were just copying each other. He thought there was no depth to the system. He wondered if there was even one original game out there. That's when he discovered the game called Dungeon and Stone. The game was developed by Oriel Davis and written by Jong Yoon-gang, and it forced players to do 100% of the work. Dungeon and Stone. Dungeon and Stone. He read the name again. He realized that its genre was RPG indie game. The game had 2D pixel graphics that were supposedly hard to come by these days. The young man thought, what the hell? There's only English. The game was called Dungeon and Stone. Since it was free, he figured he'd try it out. He saw the character selection screen, which had a lot of classes to choose from. There was human, dwarf, fairy, barbarian, furry, and a question mark. He looked at the character selection screen and saw the barbarian class. He figured he wasn't going to play much, so he'd just choose whatever. It had been a while since he played a vertical scroll game. The screen showed his character's stats, level 1, with skills like roar. The game suggested he find a right companion, and the young man realized that's what he was supposed to do. He thought the illustration was nice, but soon enough, he was getting really into the game. He looked focused and determined. He glanced at the clock and was shocked. What the hell? When did it get so late? He hadn't realized how much time had passed. He became obsessed with Dungeon and Stone. The game was so much fun. He was completely hooked. Dungeon and Stone had some interesting features. Some might call them unique. Others might call them absolutely garbage. The game required a NPC teammate. And in this game, when you die, you are really dead. No coming back. The only options were to start a new game or delete it. You had to start all over again. At first, it was fun. The young man yelled, saying he died because of the priests when he was almost there. He was furious. A woman in the room asked him to please be quiet. He apologized, saying he was sorry. He looked a little embarrassed. The young man muttered to himself that there was a trap, calculating that he needed to go up 3, left 4, and down 1. He looked focused, trying to figure out the solution. And later, he was just too stubborn trying to beat the game. He wasn't going to give up. Turns out it was such a failed game that there were no tutorials, neither in Korean nor English. Then, however long it takes, he would beat it on his own. He was determined to finish it. The young man looked serious, ready to face any challenge. He wasn't going to back down now. He thought back to when he first started playing the game in the hospital. He had no idea how much it would consume his life. From getting drafted as a public service worker to going back to university, graduating, going to interviews, getting assigned to a company, and going to and from work, he always had the game on his mind. He was obsessed with selecting his character, Furian or Polly, Barbarian, Furian, or Polly. He always continued to play Dungeon and Stone. It was the one constant in his life. He would always die and see the "you died" message. That's insane. He would just press the button to start a new game and keep playing. He died again and again and again. He checked the level and stats of his character. Level 7, ability 50, vitality 4, HP 140, comprehensive battle index 53. Then he died again at level 25. He just kept playing. 9 years passed in the blink of an eye. He had been playing this game for almost a decade. Finally, after all that time, the moment had arrived. He was so close to the end. It was the final boss room. He was about to finish the game. The gate of the abyss, Usaos, loomed before him. He could almost taste victory. He asked if anyone had seen that, if there were any other players who had gotten this far. He was the best. He shouted that he had sacrificed his 20s for this game. 9 years. He was so ready to finally beat it. Up on the screen, a message popped up. It asked if he wanted to enter the boss room. Of course, the answer was yes. The game warned that he might never come back if he went in there. It asked if he really wanted to enter. He wondered if it was because it was the final boss that it felt so ominous. The young man was not intimidated at all. He thought there was no way he wouldn't go in after getting this far. The screen flashed as it started loading. He didn't expect to win on his first try. He was going to gather as much info as possible to plan a strategy. The young man wondered how many patterns the boss would have and what its attributes were. It probably had an ultimate move too. He wondered what would happen if he just killed the boss in one go after all this prep. But then he was like, huh? Was it already done? That was why. The screen flashed a message. He had reached the abyss. He had been slow to catch on. The tutorial was complete. The guy looked up, totally shocked. Tutorial? He was like, wait, what? This was Korean. The young man thought Dungeon and Stone only supported English. The guy was getting angry, remembering something. He thought about how hard he had to work to understand all the English for nearly a decade. Suddenly, a message appeared on the screen. User check complete. The guy was like, what? A strong ray of light poured out, and the young man felt a pain that burned through his body. The guy was like, what the heck? Starting transmission. The light intensified. He lost consciousness. Suddenly, a voice boomed, congratulating the young warriors. The voice continued, announcing that today, they would all leave this sacred place. But Bjorn wondered who was being so loud. The voice boomed again, saying that when they opened their eyes again, they would become proper warriors. The warriors looked up, ready for anything. Bjorn was completely confused by what was going on. Turns out, he was faced with an unbelievable situation. Bjorn looked around and realized that they were using torches instead of LED lights. He was still trying to figure out what was going on. He noticed that there were muscular barbarians everywhere he looked. It was quite a sight. A weird man was giving a speech, telling them to pick a weapon that fit them. The speaker seemed very excited about it. Bjorn wondered what the man was talking about. He realized he was understanding a language he had never heard before, and he was confused about why he was even there in the first place. Bjorn told himself to calm down. He was clearly overwhelmed by the situation. Bjorn was trying to figure out what he was supposed to do, since this felt like the start of a really hard game. He was sweating a bit, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, a thought popped into his head. He needed to understand the situation and get as much information as he could. Bjorn started checking his body, but he was confused. He didn't understand what was happening. He noticed that he had rough hands, strong muscles, and tattoos all over his body. The young warrior realized his body was moving freely. Bjorn stood there, trying to get a grip on the situation. He looked around, trying to understand where he was. Bjorn was shocked. He looked at his hands and wondered what was going on, asking himself if this was really his body. Bjorn realized this was really him, and he looked up with determination. He shouted for those who were called to come forward, his voice echoing through the area. Bjorn was confused by the situation, but he kept his cool. He recognized one of the men as Karak, Venon's third son, and wondered what the hell was going on. The tension was thick in the air as Karak stood face to face with another warrior. The two men were ready to fight, the fiery background adding to the intensity of the moment. The warrior's hand tightened around his weapon, preparing for a fight. He wasn't going to back down, no matter what. The guy with the beard grinned, showing off the double-headed axe. He seemed pretty happy with his choice. The man in the back looked on with a smirk. The man shouted that Vanon's third son, Karak, was now a warrior. His voice boomed through the area, and immediately, he called for Feneline's second daughter, Einar, to step forward. The man looked off to the side, his brow furrowed. He thought that this situation seemed familiar. Something about it was making him uneasy. Turns out, young warriors were picking their weapons. The whole scene was like a deja vu moment for the man. The man with the spear was told it was a fitting weapon for a bright man like him. He seemed pleased with the compliment. On the other hand, the woman with the sword grinned confidently. The narrator continued, saying that being acknowledged as a warrior was a great honor for the young warriors. He spoke with such force, it seemed to echo through the room. Suddenly, a voice boomed out, offering Rafdonia's blessings to everyone. It seemed like a blessing was being bestowed upon them. The city was a beautiful sight, sparkling in the sunlight. At the same time, a sense of urgency filled the air. Bjorn's eyes widened as he realized something important. He was certain that he recognized what was happening. Turns out, he was looking at the Dungeon and Stone game screen. The screen prompted him to select his character, a familiar sight from his past life. At the top, the screen showed the game's character selection, with options like human, dwarf, fairy, and barbarian. The game even showed the barbarian he had picked before. At the same time, Bjorn's face was filled with shock as he started to understand what was happening. The pixelated background of the game was still visible. He realized that he was now in the barbarian character he had been playing. Below, white lines appeared, adding to the confusion. A speech bubble appeared, with him wondering how the hell this had happened. Bjorn's face was a mix of confusion and disbelief as he tried to process the situation. He said, "No way," clearly not believing what was happening. He stammered, realizing that this was actually Dungeon in Stone. The other barbarian next to Bjorn looked just as surprised, with wide eyes and an open mouth. Bjorn looked around, totally lost, and asked himself what the hell he was doing there. He was clearly scared and confused about his current situation. Someone noticed that Bjorn was acting differently from the other barbarians. At the same time, Einar looked down, lost in her own thoughts. Bjorn realized he wasn't the only one who had been pulled into the game. He wondered who had just spoken out loud. The tension in the air was thick as the old barbarian watched everything unfold. His expression was serious, like he knew something was about to happen. The old barbarian asked when he had arrived, wondering if Bjorn was the other person who had entered the game. He stared intently, waiting for an answer. The man yelled, filled with rage. His face was red, and sweat dripped down his forehead as he screamed. He continued, blaming everything on some stupid dude. The man pointed with fury. His eyes narrowed. Then, the text bubble appeared, indicating someone was about to speak. Someone apologized nervously, looking scared. He was sweating, and his eyes were wide with fear. The first man accused someone, saying it was them. His face was full of anger, and he glared intensely. Bjorn looked around, his eyes wide with disbelief. He asked if this place was really Dungeon and Stone. The warrior was clearly not expecting this. Then, a voice responded to him, asking what he was talking about. The question hung in the air, unanswered. At the same time, a barbarian swung his axe down with incredible speed. Bjorn looked up, seeing the attack coming right at him. Bjorn stared, his eyes wide with shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Bjorn's eyes widened even further, his face contorted in disbelief. He exclaimed, "What the hell?" The young man was completely taken aback by the scene. Bjorn was bleeding, but he kept his cool. He told himself to calm down, and immediately after, the young man realized he would be dead if he showed any emotion. The man declared that Kadua's son, ORM, had been possessed by an evil spirit. His voice was filled with anger. The guy put his hand on another man's shoulder. He ordered everyone to erase what the evil spirit had said from their memories. Bjorn was standing there, looking at the scene. He realized that they were going to continue with the coming-of-age ceremony. The young warrior understood what was going on. Bjorn was thinking about what it meant to be an evil spirit in this world. He realized that people like him, those who came into the game, were labeled as such. The young man's expression was one of dawning understanding and concern. He knew he had to be careful. He understood that if anyone found out he was an evil spirit, he would die. The warrior's eyes widened with fear at the thought. He shuddered, thinking about what almost happened. It could have been his head rolling on the ground right then and there. The thought terrified the young man. Bjorn steeled himself, knowing what he had to do. He needed to get through this without being found out. The young warrior focused on the task ahead. Suddenly, the speaker announced the next participant. He declared that Senik's fourth son, Sarum, should step forth. The crowd waited with anticipation. The speaker called out for the next contestant to step up. The crowd of barbarians watched with anticipation, their eyes fixed on the arena. The testers continued to shout for the next participant. They were clearly impatient to move on with the trials. Bjorn realized he didn't even know his character's name. The lack of information was starting to stress him out. Bjorn thought to himself that this damned game should at least tell him his name. He wondered if there was a stat window or something he could check. The warrior knew he couldn't just guess when his life depended on it. Bjorn knew the possibility was low, but this was the only way he had right now. He steeled himself, preparing to take a risk. The tester screamed for the next person to step up, giving them 2 seconds to respond. He figured that if no one answered, it could be another evil spirit, and he'd leave it to luck. At the same time, a pair of hands gripped each other in a firm handshake. The tester announced the next name, Bjorn, son of Jandel. He shouted it with enough force to shake the ground. A heavily tattooed, muscular arm tensed up. The warrior was getting ready to step forward. Einar and a group of other barbarians watched. They were waiting to see who would step up. 2 seconds had passed since the name was called. The tester was waiting to see if anyone would step forward. Meanwhile, the crowd of barbarians stood silently silently, waiting to see who would answer the call. Bjorn took a step forward, the sand crunching beneath his sandal. The tension was building as he moved to answer the call. Bjorn declared that was his name. He looked confident and ready to take on whatever challenge was next. But then he thought to himself that it was probably his name. He was still trying to figure out who he was in this new world. Bjorn stood face to face with a much older, bigger barbarian. The old man was huge, easily towering over him. The old barbarian stared down, his eyes narrowed with intensity. He looked like he had seen a lot of battles. Bjorn's face was covered in blood, but he didn't flinch. He kept his gaze steady, ready for whatever was coming. A voice echoed through the arena, calling him a young warrior. The old barbarian grinned, pointing towards something with a flourish. He shouted that it was time to pick a weapon. The voice boomed, declaring that Bjorn was Jandel's son. Bjorn looked up, a grin spreading across his face. He declared proudly that was his name. Bjorn looked down at his hands, his expression serious. He realized that he had to make the second most important choice. He thought about how barbarians didn't have magic, but they did have strong bodies. He was planning on raising his character as a close combat fighter. Bjorn narrowed his eyes, looking at the weapons in front of him. The young warrior announced that the weapon he would choose was this. The old man stroked his beard, looking thoughtful. He seemed to be thinking hard about something. Bjorn looked at the shield in his hands, a determined expression on his face. He knew this was the best choice he could make. Suddenly, a voice boomed out, declaring that Jandel's son, Bjorn, had become a warrior. The announcement echoed through the area, and immediately, a message appeared, stating that the synchronization was complete. It seemed like the game was registering his choice. The screen lit up with another message, confirming his overall item level was 24. The system also recorded his character information and daily log, sending the data to the administrator. Bjorn's character info popped up, showing his level was still 1. He saw that his physical stat was 25, and his mental stat was 35, with an ability of 1. His overall combat index was 67. The word Barbarian flashed on the screen. It was a reminder of the path he had chosen. He remembered when he first played as a barbarian. He thought it would be cool to use a greatsword. But the thing is, he ended up dying way too much. He just couldn't survive with that build. He was getting frustrated. He wondered how he needed to build this character so it could survive longer. He was tired of dying all the time. Dual axe, large hammer, flail. He was thinking about all the different weapons. Bjorn remembered trying different weapons and testing them all. But the thing is, it was all within the berserker meta. And one day, he had this thought. He was looking at the weapons, trying to figure out a new strategy. He wondered if a barbarian had to be played as a dealer. Barbarians are a race with high vitality and strength after all. While it might not be as good of a tanker as a dwarf, it still possesses the base for a tanker. He realized a shield might be the answer. Bjorn admitted he didn't really like doing this, since this combat method needed a lot of training. Still, he figured it'd be a pity to waste all his research efforts so far, so he decided to give it a shot. And immediately, a massive explosion erupted. The force of the blast shook the entire area. Bjorn stood tall, his shield covered in blood. The enemy was down for the count, clearly defeated. A disembodied voice stammered, clearly shocked by the turn of events. The word clear echoed in the air. At the same time, a game screen popped up, showing his stats. It showed player level 35, body 82, mentality 82, agility 45, item level 10, and comprehensive 225. The screen showed he did damage to the cockatrice, and the cockatrice did 7 damage, but it bounced off. And the screen showed that he got 1 experience for his skill, Smash. The screen said it was effective, and he knocked down a cockatrice. And the final text read, "What an OP character." Bjorn looked determined. He thought to himself that this current decision was the most rational one that he could make right now. He was trying to calm himself down and prepare for what was about to happen. He psyched himself up, declaring that he wouldn't regret it. He had to be strong and face whatever came next. There was no turning back now. Bjorn shouted for them to open up the gates. The heavy chains started to move, signaling the beginning of the ceremony. The atmosphere was tense as everyone waited for the entrance to open. The massive gates slowly creaked open, revealing a dark and ominous path. The air grew heavy with anticipation as the moment of truth approached. Everyone watched, holding their breath. The narrator explained that barbarians who had gone through the coming-of-age ceremony would enter the labyrinth. The young barbarians looked nervous, but they knew this was their destiny. They had to prove themselves. The man declared that they would go to the city with a labyrinth. His face was full of anger, like he was ready to fight. The warriors began to depart through the massive gates of Rafdonia. The chains rattled as they moved, creating a sense of foreboding. The man shouted that their fate lay in that place. He looked intense, wanting to make sure they understood the importance of their mission. The crowd of barbarians charged forward, their faces filled with determination. They were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Bjorn thought to himself that he would run along with them for now. The young man's expression was serious, knowing that he had no other choice but to join the others. The barbarians kept running forward, but some started to wonder if they even knew where they were going. They looked around nervously, realizing they might be lost. Suddenly, a loud voice boomed out, telling everyone to stop. The sudden command echoed through the area. The man shouted that he thought they had lost their way. He looked really worried. The man continued, saying that Karak, Venom's third son, had led them in the wrong direction. He didn't think that Karak deserved to be their leader and needed to take responsibility. All right, Karak told everyone to stop. He admitted that he wasn't qualified to be the leader and would step down. Einar stepped up and shouted that she would be the one to lead everyone. She looked confident and ready to take charge. Einar was wise and should be able to lead everyone to the right path, she thought. The barbarian woman smiled, feeling confident in her abilities. Meanwhile, one of the guys admitted that he thought he was lost. He looked at Einar with a worried expression. Einar looked shocked and asked if it was happening to him too. She clearly didn't expect another person to be lost. The men shouted, wondering how this could be. They needed to get to the labyrinth within the time limit. People started arguing that Einar didn't deserve to lead. They thought that Jin, Tatron's second son, should be the one in charge. Others disagreed, and the whole situation was quickly turning into a mess. The arguing was getting out of hand, and one of the guys thought they were all brainless. He realized that if this kept going on, they might never reach the labyrinth. However, he didn't want to attract attention just yet. Einar suddenly called out, saying, "Hey." She was trying to get someone's attention. Bjorn was standing in front of her. Einar asked Jondel's son if he was also there to blame her. She looked worried and defensive. Bjorn denied it. He told her that he was there to tell her how to get to the labyrinth. The young man seemed serious and determined to help. Bjorn put his finger to his lips, signaling her to be quiet. He didn't want anyone to hear them talking. Einar looked surprised and asked how. She really wanted to know how to get to the labyrinth. Bjorn told her that she just needed to follow those guys. He pointed towards a group of people walking away. One of the people in the group said that there were barbarians swarming over there. He called them foolish savages and said they wouldn't get anywhere so late at night, all armed. Einar said that she understood and would give it a try. She looked determined to follow Bjorn's advice. Einar announced that she had found the way to the labyrinth. The crowd cheered and said that she was wise, but Bjorn wondered if they were really not brainless. Einar shouted to follow her. Her voice echoed through the night sky. The labyrinth was right in front of them. It pulsed with a strange energy. The crowd cheered as they saw the labyrinth, calling it the sacred dimension of battle. Down below, Bjorn cursed under his breath, realizing that it was really the labyrinth. Bjorn wondered if it was really the right decision to enter the labyrinth. He looked worried. Bjorn stood alone for a moment, thinking that nobody would even notice if he just walked away. He knew he could slip away without anyone even realizing it. He thought back to his life before, when he had been sick all the time. He remembered being stuck in a hospital bed. Bjorn wondered how someone like him, who had never even thrown a punch, could possibly survive in the labyrinth. He looked up, his eyes narrowed, questioning if he was strong enough. Bjorn cursed the taxes of Rafodnia, wondering if there was any other way to pay them besides risking his life in the labyrinth. The system seemed designed to screw everyone over. It was one of the worst systems in the game, Dungeon and Stone. All citizens had to pay taxes from the age of 20, or they would be executed. The whole thing was messed up. There were a few ways to get money in this world, but the most common way was to go into the labyrinth and fight monsters. It was a dangerous job, but it paid the bills. Another option was to work at places like the village bars. It was safer than fighting monsters, but the pay wasn't as good. The thing is, Bjorn declared that he was a barbarian. The people in charge were not impressed and said they didn't hire savages. They were worried he would destroy their things, and they had no work for foolish barbarians. He realized that in this game, a barbarian couldn't do any normal work. Because of that, the barbarian class was the only one that received a weapon as soon as they started the game. If that wasn't the case, he wouldn't have to fight monsters. Time was running out fast. There were only 10 minutes left before the labyrinth entrance shut down. Bjorn realized that he had a big problem. He didn't know what to do. The biggest issue was that the labyrinth only opened once a month. If he missed this chance, he would be stuck. If he didn't go in this time, he would need to survive in this place for a month somehow. Bjorn wondered what would happen if he couldn't get any jobs because he was a barbarian, as the game designed. Even if he somehow survived for a month in the village, his condition would be the worst possible state. Bjorn knew that if he was going to go in, then this was the right time to do so, but he couldn't get his feet moving. Bjorn was starting to panic. He realized that this wasn't just a game anymore. His life was actually on the line. Suddenly, someone called out to him, identifying him as Jandel's son, Bjorn. The announcement made him even more nervous. Bjorn looked up and saw a girl with blonde hair. She introduced herself as Einar, Veneline's third daughter. Einar explained that she was actually the second daughter, not the third. She added that all the other warriors had already entered the labyrinth, and they were the only ones left, so they needed to hurry. Time was running out. There were only minutes left before the labyrinth closed completely. The portal was definitely getting smaller by the second. Bjorn told Einar to go in first, saying that he would follow right after. He looked at her, waiting for her to move. Einar nodded, saying all right. Einar stepped into the portal, ready to face whatever was on the other side. She looked back at Bjorn, thanking him for his help just now. She seemed grateful for his assistance. Bjorn replied that there was no need to thank him. He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. The young man seemed focused on the task ahead. Einar then asked a question, wanting to know what she needed to do to become wise like him. She admitted that she had never seen a barbarian as clever as him before. The girl added that she wanted to become like him. Bjorn looked to the side, a strange expression on his face. He told her that she needed to be reborn again. The warrior's tone was serious, but also a little sarcastic. Bjorn gave a vague answer to Einar. He told her that she must always think before she acted. The young man seemed to be trying to sound wise, but also not give away too much. Einar thanked him for the advice. She told him that she would make sure to repay him for his help if she made it back from the labyrinth. The girl had a bright smile on her face. Bjorn questioned if she would make it back. He seemed surprised by her lack of confidence. The warrior then explained that in the game, barbarians were people that didn't know fear. Bjorn then asked Einar if she was also afraid of dying. He stared at her intently, waiting for her answer. The young man seemed to be trying to gauge her true feelings. Einar didn't respond immediately. Her mouth was slightly open, as if she was about to say something, but stopped herself. The girl seemed to be struggling with what to say next. Einar said that it was natural. She seemed to be agreeing with Bjorn's point about fear. The girl looked up at him, waiting for his reaction. Bjorn then spoke about his own fears. He admitted that he was afraid of dying, but he had been born as a warrior. The young man seemed to be trying to come to terms with his situation. Bjorn continued, explaining that he would die if he didn't fight. He then asked Einar if it wasn't the same for her. The warrior was trying to understand if they were in the same boat. Bjorn realized that it was. He thought that they were the same as him, and they simply had no choice but to fight. The young man seemed to be finding some comfort in that realization. Bjorn explained that if they didn't kill monsters, they wouldn't be able to survive in the city. He knew that the only way to live was to keep fighting. The warrior looked determined. Bjorn declared that they should survive and meet again. He added that barbarians learn to overcome their fear and push forward, and that they were truly amazing. The young man looked determined to live. Bjorn then declared that he, too, was a barbarian. He raised his shield higher, showing his resolve. The warrior seemed ready to face whatever came next. Suddenly, a warning appeared, saying that there was only 1 minute left until the labyrinth closed. The foot seemed to be hurrying, trying to get out in time. Bjorn admitted that he was scared, but he was trying to push through it. He looked determined, despite the fear in his eyes. The young man knew what he had to do. The warning appeared again, shouting that the labyrinth was closing soon. The energy crackled around them. It was a race against time. Bjorn declared that not only did he have a strong barbarian physique, but it was dangerous. He asked everyone to stand back. The young man added that he also had the knowledge that he gained from raising thousands of characters. Bjorn grinned, saying that he was definitely going to survive in this place. He looked confident, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The warrior seemed sure of his abilities. Suddenly, a message popped up, announcing that they had entered the level 1 crystal cave. The place seemed quiet and still. It was a new beginning. Bjorn stared intently at something in the distance. The tension in the air was thick. He was clearly focused on whatever he saw. Bjorn looked genuinely surprised by something he saw. He wondered what it could be. The young man seemed caught off guard. Bjorn looked around, completely disoriented. He shouted, wondering where the hell he was. The warrior was clearly confused and trying to figure out his surroundings. Bjorn thought that he was an expert when it came to dungeons and stones. He seemed confident in his skills. That's how he came up with this conclusion. He looked serious, like he had a plan. He figured that if he combined the strong body of a barbarian with his game knowledge, at the same time, he was remembering his past. He thought he could survive. That's what the young man thought back then. Bjorn realized he couldn't see anything at all. He looked absolutely furious. Einar was ready for anything. She looked confident, like she knew what was coming. The other barbarians with her were also prepared to fight. Based on the game designs, this was something he was familiar with. Because there are crystals stuck on the walls of level 1 of the labyrinth, there's no real need for torches. At the same time, Bjorn was thinking about the game map. Wait, don't tell me that this area is the darkness region. He seemed shocked by this. The place that's on the furthest outskirts of Labyrinth Level 1, the super rare area that doesn't have light. This was bad news. But the darkness region isn't usually the start point though. He seemed confused by this. No, this is the real world, so nothing's guaranteed, he realized. Since the start point is random, it's possible for someone to start in the darkness region, unlike how it was in the game. For now, he thought, he needed to check his status window, equipment window, character information, status, inventory, skill, daily log. Bjorn cursed under his breath. Nothing's working as expected, he thought, looking furious. Bjorn figured there was no point in staying put. He decided to try moving in a direction first, hoping it would lead somewhere. He started crawling forward, carefully feeling his way through the dark cave. The young man was hoping to find a way out of this place. Bjorn wondered if he was moving too slowly and considered crawling faster, but he knew he needed to be cautious, just in case there were any hidden dangers. Bjorn suddenly gasped, his eyes widening in terror. He realized something was terribly wrong. Turns out, he'd stepped right into a goblin trap. The warrior was completely caught off guard. The trap clamped down hard on his foot, drawing blood. The pain was intense, but he knew he couldn't afford to make a sound. The system then flashed a message, confirming the obvious. He'd stepped into a goblin trap. This was just great. Bjorn gritted his teeth, trying to endure the pain. He told himself he needed to calm down and not panic. He knew he couldn't let out any sound, no matter how much it hurt. Silence was his only defense right now. He knew goblins were the kind of monsters that used traps on level 1. Bjorn figured the scumbag who laid this trap was probably waiting somewhere nearby. Bjorn's face was a mask of pain and concentration. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he tried to stay quiet. He kept his eyes narrowed, trying to stay focused. Bjorn wondered if the goblin was even nearby. He told himself that might be the case. If he was lucky, the goblin might have gone away for a moment. Bjorn gripped his shield tightly. He knew such relieved thoughts were the most dangerous ones. He thought to himself that if there's a trap, there must be a goblin nearby. The young man realized that if a goblin heard his scream, Bjorn coughed, realizing that a goblin had spotted him after he got caught in the trap. At the same time, the goblin stood there with glowing red eyes, ready to attack. The goblin's face was grotesque, its sharp claws ready to tear him apart. It would wait for him to lose his strength while waiting in the darkness. Bjorn knew that he mustn't make a sound. He realized that this was how Dungeon and Stone worked. In that case, the young man decided to do what was necessary first. There was paralyzing poison in the trap, which annoyed him. Bjorn thought that if they had given him leather boots instead of useless sandals like these. As a result, he found himself annoyed at the situation. Bjorn told himself, what the hell? What's the point of saying all this now? He knew he needed to stop whining and get moving already. Bjorn knew that if he needed to fight, he had to do it quickly. He looked absolutely furious, ready to take on whatever was hiding nearby. He told the hidden enemy to come on out. The poison from the trap was already making his feet bleed. It seemed the poison was spreading. Bjorn realized that his right foot had gone numb. Bjorn knew the enemy was already hiding out there. He thought that he didn't even feel fear because of the paralyzing poison, which he guessed was a good thing. Bjorn was getting annoyed by the silence. He shouted, demanding that the scumbag come out already. Bjorn wondered if he was just imagining things. He thought maybe there wasn't a goblin there at all. He looked around suspiciously, trying to see if anything was hiding. Bjorn kept thinking to himself, even if he was acting like a fool, he knew he had to be careful. Bjorn told the enemy to just stay where it was. He said that he was gonna leave. The barbarian looked serious, like he meant it. Bjorn thought that he would become an idiot who survives. He was determined to live, no matter what. Bjorn suddenly insulted the hidden goblin. He told the enemy that its mother was a goblin. The young man's foot was still bleeding from the trap. Bjorn kept insulting the goblin's family. He said its father was a goblin too. The barbarian realized this was dangerous, since his bleeding wasn't stopping. He added that its sibling was also a goblin, and he was starting to feel like his brain had been dipped in alcohol. That's why he was also calling the goblin a goblin. The goblin was huge, towering over Bjorn from behind. It was clear that he was in serious trouble, facing such a massive enemy while weakened. Suddenly, Bjorn's eyes widened. He heard footsteps nearby, alerting him to the immediate danger. Then, a voice boomed, declaring that it moved. The threat was getting closer. Bjorn asked what was wrong. He wondered if the goblin couldn't take him insulting its family. The young man realized the footsteps came from behind, and the goblin probably came closer because he was getting further away from it. Bjorn realized that even though he knew something something was there, it was still hard to see. He told himself he needed to run faster. He looked around nervously, trying to figure out where the threat was coming from. Bjorn started running. His feet splashed in the water, and he could feel the blood still flowing from his wounds. He knew he couldn't keep this up for long. He kept running. The sound of his bare feet hitting the stone floor echoed through the cave. The barbarian was trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was chasing him. Bjorn collapsed on the ground, exhausted. He looked over and saw the goblin standing a short distance away. The young man knew he was in trouble, but he was too tired to move. Bjorn realized that whatever was following him was keeping its distance. He noticed that when he stopped, it stopped too. The fighter was starting to think he was dealing with something smarter than he expected. The goblin looked down on Bjorn, clearly enjoying his suffering. It was rejoicing, watching its prey bleed out. The little scumbag was probably waiting for him to die slowly, terrified by its laughter. Bjorn realized the goblin was smarter than he thought. He figured the little creep wasn't even bothering to hide anymore. The young man decided it was time to change his strategy. Bjorn suddenly stood up, surprising the goblin. He let out a yell as he charged forward. The barbarian wasn't going to let the goblin have its way, but Bjorn immediately collapsed, his legs giving out. The attack had clearly taken a lot out of him. The fighter was still badly injured. Bjorn thought to himself that his prey had collapsed just as it wished. He was setting a trap for the little monster. The young man was going to make it pay. The goblin stood over Bjorn's hand, looking down at him. The little monster seemed to be enjoying the situation. It was probably wondering if Bjorn was still alive. The goblin suddenly shouted for Bjorn to come closer. It was clearly trying to lure him into another trap. The little scumbag thought it was so clever. Suddenly, a rock hit Bjorn on the head. He realized what the goblin was doing. The young man was starting to understand how smart these things really were. Bjorn thought to himself, was the goblin really throwing rocks at him to see if he was dead? He was starting to think this was more than just a dumb monster. Bjorn realized that the goblin was smarter than he expected. He thought to himself that they were definitely more intelligent than barbarians. The warrior was starting to get worried. Suddenly, a warning flashed, declaring that something was coming. The message was clear, but what exactly was on its way? Then, the sound of something crawling nearby echoed through the cave. A goblin was standing over Bjorn, holding a small axe. The little monster was ready to strike. The goblin reached down and touched Bjorn's face. It was checking to see if he was really dead. The barbarian's eyes suddenly flashed red. Bjorn suddenly stood up. He looked down at the goblin, his eyes burning with anger. The young man greeted the monster with a dark expression. Bjorn shouted that the goblin was a scumbag. He was furious that the monster had tried to trick him. The warrior was ready to make the goblin pay. Bjorn was ready to strike. He moved with incredible speed, his fist aimed right at the goblin's head. The barbarian was about to deliver a devastating blow. The goblin realized his reach was too short. He was panicking because he couldn't escape the incoming attack. At the same time, Bjorn was confused. Bjorn asked what was happening. Red energy was flowing around his hand. The young man didn't understand what was going on with his body. Bjorn realized his body was moving by itself. He was completely shocked and had no idea why. The warrior was losing control. Bjorn's fist continued to move forward. He was still paralyzed, unable to stop the attack. The young man felt like a passenger in his own body. Bjorn's fist crashed into the ground with incredible force. The impact sent tremors through the cave, and dust flew everywhere. Bjorn realized he could vividly sense the goblin's movements. He felt stronger than ever before. The young man was ready to take the fight to the goblin. Bjorn thought that this body was way different from the sick one he had in the hospital. He declared that the goblin was the prey now. The warrior was feeling confident. Bjorn shouted that this was the body of a barbarian. He let out a wild yell, feeling the power coursing through him. The young man was ready for action. Bjorn stood panting over the fallen goblin. He was catching his breath after the savage attack. The barbarian had won. Bjorn was panting hard, trying to catch his breath. He was covered in sweat and grime, clearly exhausted from the fight. The barbarian was breathing heavily. Bjorn slammed his fist into the ground with a loud thud. The force of the impact shook the earth around him. The young man was letting out his frustration. He punched the ground again, even harder this time. Dust and small rocks flew up from the impact. The warrior was furious. Bjorn looked down at his hands, clenching them into fists. He was trying to control his anger. The young man was clearly struggling with something. Bjorn punched something with incredible force, sending debris flying everywhere. The impact echoed through the cave. The barbarian was unleashing his rage. The screen popped up, telling him he had defeated a goblin. Turns out he got EXP +1 for that. Bjorn was kneeling on the ground, panting. He was still paralyzed from the trap, but at least the goblin was dead. Bjorn's eyes widened. He noticed the goblin's body was starting to disappear. He was shocked by this. A bright flash filled his vision. It was just like in the game, he realized. And then a crystal appeared on the ground. He wondered what it was. Bjorn was thinking about money. The currency that's being used in Dungeon and Stone was. Bjorn stared at the crystal. It was a grade 9 magic crystal. Its value was. The crystal was worth a piece of bread. He couldn't believe it. Bjorn's face was filled with disappointment. A tear rolled down his cheek as he realized the value of his reward. Bjorn was furious. He thought to himself that this was what he got for going through all that garbage. Bjorn was still stuck in the trap. He thought to himself, right. The screen went black. The text simply said, "This place." At the top, the panel showed several monsters. Below, the text explained that it was a world where labyrinths and monsters existed, and that dead monsters would leave items behind before disappearing. Meanwhile, the image shifted to a city. The text explained that outside the labyrinths, there were familiar game sceneries and other races living together. The screen changed to red. Bjorn realized that this was definitely the world within the game that he knew. Bjorn was still stuck in the trap, and he was in pain. He thought to himself, but he was determined. Bjorn told himself that he would never confuse his reality by thinking it was just a game. Bjorn finally managed to get free. He started walking deeper into the cave, but the blood on the ground made him nervous. The system kept telling him that he was still bleeding. It was like the game wanted to make sure he didn't forget his situation. The message appeared again. He was still bleeding. The blood trail he was leaving behind was getting bigger. Bjorn was lying on the ground, panting heavily. He was clearly exhausted from crawling, but he kept pushing himself forward. Bjorn was breathing hard. He cursed, realizing that he was still bleeding, but at least nothing was broken. He kept crawling. Bjorn admitted that giving up his pride as a human had its perks. Since he wasn't using his injured leg, it didn't hurt as much, and he was actually moving faster than he thought. Bjorn was thinking about how great it would be to not step on any more traps. He really wanted to be done with those things. But then, crap. Bjorn realized he was caught in another trap. He cursed, saying there was another one. Bjorn was trying to stay positive. He told himself that other parts of his body were hurting now, but he could endure it to survive. At the same time, the system kept reminding him that he was still bleeding. The bleeding just wouldn't stop. He could see the blood flowing from his leg, and just to make sure he didn't forget, the system repeated that he was still bleeding, over and over. Bjorn was breathing heavily, clearly in a bad spot. He realized that this was dangerous, and he needed to find someone who could help him, fast. Bjorn was still crawling through the darkness, trying to find a way out. He was breathing hard and sweating, but he told himself that if he kept going in one direction, he would get out of there. Bjorn wondered what had happened to that other guy from before. He was curious if he had died, or if he had woken up back in his original body. Bjorn kept thinking about his situation. He figured he was bleeding so much he understood why humans had religions. At the same time, the system kept reminding him that he was still bleeding. The system kept repeating the same message over and over. It warned him that there was less than 5% of his vitality left. In a moment of despair, it provided a distraction. The system warned that if he didn't get treatment soon, he might die. He was in serious trouble. Bjorn was thinking about his situation. It was just like him to be in a mess like this. Bjorn kept crawling forward. He was leaving a trail of blood as he went. Bjorn figured he was doing well because it was getting brighter. He added that the entire first floor couldn't be covered in darkness. Bjorn knew he needed to get to a lighter area. He could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Bjorn was sure there were 1 or 2 people who could help him, but he immediately realized what a joke that was. Bjorn was standing over another person. He looked down with a smirk, like he knew something the other didn't. The barbarian was clearly enjoying this. Bjorn was still seeing things. He asked himself why anyone would help a dying barbarian like him. The young man wondered if he needed to be a beautiful woman or an intelligent man to get help. Bjorn thought he was going insane. He said that he guessed he was pretty smart, since he was talking to himself. The fighter wondered what he was going to do if he didn't keep going forward, saying he needed to do something. He figured he was seeing illusions now. He had to push forward. Bjorn was starting to lose it. He figured he would probably run into a monster before he encountered a human. The young man hoped he would at least have better vision than now. Bjorn was sure he was going crazy from losing too much blood. He told himself that he needed to survive no matter what. Then he questioned himself, wondering how he could possibly do that in his current state. And immediately, he heard a voice in his head calling him a loser and saying he was about to die. It told him to just give up and be comfortable. Bjorn refused to give up no matter what. He wouldn't let this beat him. The barbarian was determined to survive. Suddenly, a light appeared. A warning popped up, saying that less than 4% of his vitality remained. Bjorn was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. He pleaded for anyone to help him. Suddenly, a group of adventurers appeared above him. They were all staring down, seemingly surprised by what they saw. One of the adventurers, Drouse, pointed down. He told the others that there was a dying barbarian over there. Another one asked if it was a barbarian. A warning popped up, saying that less than 4% of his vitality remained and that he was still bleeding. Then another warning appeared, saying that less than 2% of his vitality remained. But he got an achievement. His mental stat would keep rising by 1. Bjorn looked up at the adventurers with a pained expression. He thought to himself that the guy looked like a novice. The barbarian then pleaded for them to help him, calling them jerks. One of the adventurers wondered if it was suspicious. The situation seemed strange to the group. One of the adventurers looked down, confused. He wondered out loud how a novice could have gotten there faster than they did. The adventurer seemed annoyed by this. Back on the ground, Bjorn was struggling to speak. He tried to say something, but all that came out was a pained groan. It was getting harder to stay conscious. Bjorn's face was covered in blood and sweat. He gritted his teeth, trying to endure the pain. Every breath was a struggle. Meanwhile, the adventurer was still staring down at him. Bjorn, desperate, cursed and demanded that they stop staring and help him. He was running out of time. The adventurer looked down with a sly smile. He seemed to be enjoying Bjorn's suffering. Something wasn't right about this guy. One of the adventurers asked Priestess Ursina if she could heal the injured man. Bjorn, who was lying on the ground, was shocked. He thought to himself, "What? A priestess? There's a priestess in your party?" The priestess looked down, and Bjorn realized that if they had a priestess, they must be pretty strong. He thought he was saved, but then he immediately refused the help. The man looked down at Bjorn with a sly smile. He asked if that was right, clearly amused by the situation. The man said that if Bjorn didn't want the priestess's help, it couldn't be helped. He then asked Potsren to give him one of his potions, saying it was only for emergencies. He promised to pay him back once they were outside. The potion was pulled out of the bag. The liquid inside was red. Potsren said that since it wasn't divine powers, it was going to hurt a bit. Bjorn, lying on the ground, told him to hurry up. He looked like he was bracing himself for the pain. The red potion poured onto Bjorn's wound, soaking into his skin. It looked like it was burning as it made contact. A system message popped up, saying his vitality was quickly increasing due to the ongoing recovery, but the barbarian's face was contorted in pain. Bjorn was clearly not enjoying the healing process. What the hell is this? He thought to himself, feeling the effects of the potion. Bjorn screamed in agony. The pain was intense, and he felt like he was being burned alive. He couldn't believe how much it hurt. Bjorn felt like his entire body was melting from the inside. He realized that this was why they didn't allow the potion to be used mid-battle. It was way too intense. The pain was so intense that Bjorn screamed out loud. He couldn't believe how much it hurt, feeling like he was being burned alive. The potion bottle lay on the ground, surrounded by a pool of blood. It was clear that the healing process had been brutal, even if it was effective. With a grunt, Bjorn pushed himself up from the ground. He was still breathing heavily, but he managed to get back on his feet. Bjorn stood there, catching his breath. The barbarian still felt the after effects of the potion, but he was ready to move on. Bjorn's face was covered in sweat. He thought to himself that he really thought he was gonna die. The barbarian was clearly shaken by how close he had come to death. Someone spoke from the shadows, demanding to know how a novice like him had gotten there before them. The voice sounded suspicious, like they didn't believe he was telling the truth. A figure in full armor stood over Bjorn, casting a long shadow. The armored warrior looked down on him with a cold, assessing gaze. Bjorn looked up at the armored figure, who made it clear that they were willing to pay for information about a secret passage. The barbarian realized that was their real objective all along. Bjorn explained that it was probably for the best, since goodwill without a reason was suspicious. He added that he didn't know how he got there. He just stepped into the labyrinth and ended up in that place. The armored figure considered what Bjorn had said. He explained that due to the dimensional instability, people could fall into the outskirts of darkness sometimes. He added that the probability was so low that it only happened once every 100 years. Bjorn listened carefully. He repeated, questioning if it only happened once every 100 years. The barbarian was surprised by how rare the event was. The mage and priestess stood side by side. They had a mage and priestess in their party, which meant they were at least mid to high level. The pair looked like they had seen their fair share of battles. Drows. Bjorn thought to himself about what the armored figure had said. He couldn't believe that he just happened to experience something so rare on his first trip. The young man was starting to think he was incredibly lucky, or unlucky. The barbarian continued to think. He wondered how he had experienced something that the mage and priestess hadn't even seen before. This was all too strange for him. Drows thanked Bjorn for the interesting story he had told them. He looked at the barbarian with a slight smile. Drows told Bjorn that he could leave and not worry about paying for the potion. He gave off a sinister smile. Bjorn thought to himself that time spent in the labyrinth was as precious as gold. He looked at the ground, thinking. The party left Bjorn to recover on his own. Because of that, he thought it was a miracle they had spent so much time on him to begin with. Bjorn was thinking he should be happy that he survived. He was lucky to be alive. Bjorn stood there, covered in blood. Turns out, he hated being pitied. It felt disgusting to him. Meanwhile, the group of adventurers continued their trek through the cave. They seemed to be making good progress, heading deeper into the labyrinth. One of the men was saying that the barbarian was really lucky. He went on to say that if the guy had stepped on a goblin trap on the first floor, he would have died eventually. He was lucky he met them. The man's companion chimed in, saying it was lucky that he met Drows, not him. He added that he didn't even want to use his potion because he was too cheap. He then asked the priestess if she didn't think so too. The priestess, Ursina, remained silent, her expression unreadable. She just stared ahead, seemingly lost in thought. Patran scoffed, asking if the others thought everyone was like them. He argued that if it weren't for the temple's rules, Ursina would have already healed the barbarian. He then questioned if that was really the case, saying he'd met so many two-faced people. Patran told Drows that he should learn a thing or two from him. He pointed out when Drows had asked if there was a secret passage out of consideration. Patran emphasized that barbarians don't like receiving help from others. Drows chuckled, saying that Patran was too kind. He seemed to be enjoying the conversation and the praise. One of the men wondered when the barbarian's blood trail was going to end. He asked if it hadn't been a while already, sounding impatient. The speaker said that judging from the barbarian's mentality so far, he didn't think he was all that lucky, like the first man said. The man added that he was sure the trail ended somewhere around there. One of the people in the group stated that if they were going to take the shortcut, they needed to turn there. He added that it was nice having a guide. The speaker seemed grateful to have someone who knew the way. One of the women exclaimed that Drows was incredible for memorizing the entire map of the first floor. She pointed out that most guides only knew the rough direction. The other woman asked if that was so, looking impressed. Drows listened to their praise with a thoughtful expression. He seemed to be considering their words carefully. His eyes narrowed slightly. One of the men observed that he thought they were the first ones there. He was glad that they had hurried. The speaker seemed relieved that they had arrived before anyone else. Someone reached out and touched the stone structure. The hand lingered there for a moment, as if feeling the stone's energy. The portal to the second floor was right in front of them, shining with a powerful light. One of the men reached out, ready to take the next step. The man declared that the portal would take them to the second floor. He told everyone to go, smiling confidently. One of the women started walking towards the portal, ready to go to the second floor. She seemed eager to continue the adventure, but someone suddenly yelled for them to wait. The group stopped, turning to see what the problem was. One of the people pointed out a sandal on the ground, covered in blood. She recognized it as the one the barbarian had been wearing earlier. The man with the white hair looked up, realizing something important. He said that he thought the other person was right, with a serious look on his face. The camera panned down to the dark cave, showing a faint light source. The cave looked dangerous and mysterious. Back with the group, they all looked worried. They seemed to be discussing the missing barbarian and what might have happened to him. Drows asked how long it would take to get back to where they found the barbarian. He wanted to know the distance, especially if they didn't take the shortcut. The man smiled creepily, finding something funny. He thought it was amazing that the barbarian had crawled so far in the dark, calling the guy a monstrous scumbag. Ursina stared at Drows, saying that the barbarian had to be out of his mind. She asked Patran if he agreed with her, looking at him expectantly. Drows thought to himself, wondering if he would have crawled for hours without any certainty. He couldn't imagine doing that. Patran looked up, realizing something important. He mentioned that, thinking back on it now, the barbarian was holding out his right hand toward them. The group remembered that he showed them the magic crystal. At the same time, the barbarian was still clutching the crystal tightly in his hand. Patran realized that even after crawling that entire time, the barbarian didn't forget his trade item. He was impressed by the man's dedication. The man's expression twisted into a sly grin as he realized something. He admitted that he was wrong before, because the barbarian wouldn't have had anything else to trade. Then, another voice broke the silence. He asked Drows what the barbarian's name was. Another voice boomed out, rejecting the idea that the barbarian was just lucky. He declared that lunatics like that don't die easily unless something crazy happens. The man's face contorted with intensity as he continued. He insisted that no matter how tough things get or how much pain they have to deal with, the barbarian stood amidst a swirl of blood and raw energy. The scene was a testament to his brutal tenacity. They will never treat death as an escape route. This was not a game to be taken lightly. The screen showed a message saying he had defeated the goblin. After almost dying, another message popped up. It said he had defeated the goblin again. Bjorn smashed his fist into the goblin's face, yelling, "Smash, you son of a jerk!" At the bottom of the screen, he thought that he kept running into goblins. Bjorn swung his shield with all his might, crushing another goblin. The young warrior was clearly getting annoyed by the constant waves of enemies. Another message appeared, saying he had defeated the goblin. Bjorn thought to himself that they kept coming. He admitted he was nervous at first, but now that he could see again, these goblins were no threat. Bjorn noticed the traps were just randomly placed on the ground. He thought that the people who set them up were idiots because they didn't even try to hide them with dirt. He thought that their ambush was too predictable and their hiding places were too obvious. The young warrior swung his axe at an incoming goblin. Bjorn smashed the goblin with his shield, yelling, "Where are you going, you scumbag?" The force of the impact sent the monster flying backwards. Bjorn stared forward with a serious look on his face. The only problem was, Bjorn grimaced, thinking that he was so hungry. He could feel his stomach growling. Bjorn was thinking that the deputy chief probably had some food for him. He was really hoping he could get his hands on it. He looked down at the empty food bag in his hand. Bjorn realized something was wrong and cursed. Bjorn started to wonder if crawling on the ground was the wrong choice. He was starting to regret his decision. He started eating, but then he realized something bad. Out of the 7 days worth of rations, 5 were already gone. Bjorn figured he would just need to eat as little as possible. He looked determined to make the rations last. Bjorn was eating some crusty, dry bread. He was surprised at how delicious it was, saying that when he used his spit to melt it, it tasted sweet. Bjorn was chewing on the bread, but he was starting to get thirsty. He frowned, already thinking about his next problem. He wondered where he was going to get water. It was just one thing after another, and he was starting to feel the pressure. At the top, Bjorn was standing in the dungeon. At the same time, he remembered that in Dungeon and Stone, there was a hunger system that forced players to eat and drink. He recalled that it only activated in the labyrinth, and he never needed to carry water around since he just needed to eat. But then he realized that this wasn't a game anymore, and he was in real trouble. Bjorn was covered in blood and looked frustrated. He thought that the game was already hard enough, but now that it was real, the difficulty was insane. He glanced around. Still covered in blood. It was just another world that happened to be similar to a game that he knew. Since the deputy chief didn't give him water, Bjorn was sure there was a supply of water somewhere in the labyrinth. He was determined to find it. Bjorn heard something. He knew it. It was the sound of water, finally. Bjorn walked forward and saw a person. He was surprised. The man looked around suspiciously. He seemed to be listening for something, his expression tight with concern. Bjorn recalled that, aside from the Blondes group, this was his first real encounter with other adventurers. He was starting to get a feel for how things worked in this world, but there was no conversation, he realized. Bjorn stood on the stairs, surrounded by glowing crystals. Another man walked away without a word. He kept his head down, focused on moving forward. It was as if there was an unspoken rule not to interact with other adventurers unless it was absolutely necessary, Bjorn thought. He wondered what was behind that. Bjorn counted the red gems one by one, his fingers stained with blood. He muttered the numbers under his breath, focusing on the task at hand. The barbarian sat cross-legged, looking down at the pile of gems with a satisfied expression. He thought that he had collected a lot. He started thinking back on how he was dying, which was an impressive situation. But there was another problem. Bjorn was so tired. He had hunted so many goblins, so it was a given that he was really sleepy now. There were 2 ways in which you can sleep in the labyrinth, he thought. First, you leave your life in the hands of God and sleep. Or second, Bjorn looked at the group and proposed that they become allies. He suggested that they find allies to protect each other in this dangerous place. One of the group members stammered, apologizing to Bjorn. He seemed nervous and scared. Another member of the group interrupted, saying that they already had all the necessary members for their party. He looked at Bjorn with a mix of fear and annoyance. The group stated that their party was full and they weren't keen on barbarians. One of them even complained about the stench of blood coming from him. Bjorn was left standing alone, the rejection hanging in the air. He didn't say anything, but the silence spoke volumes. Bjorn was thinking about how he couldn't believe he was rejected by everyone. He was clearly upset by their decision. Bjorn was looking absolutely furious. Blood splattered on his face. He cursed those scumbags under his breath. He thought to himself that it wasn't like he was asking to join their party officially. The barbarian just wanted to be temporary allies to spend the night. Suddenly, someone called out to Bjorn. He turned around, curious about who was talking to him. The person asked if he was perhaps. The man approached Bjorn with a smile, asking if he was looking for an overnight companion. He seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about his eyes. Bjorn looked absolutely furious. Blood still splattered on his face. He asked what the man had just said, wondering who the hell this guy was. The man kept smiling, saying he guessed Bjorn wasn't looking for an overnight companion after all. He had thought he could get some sleep, since the barbarian seemed reliable, but apparently not. Bjorn realized that was what the man meant. He thought to himself that the guy should have just said so. Bjorn looked directly at the man, stating that he was indeed looking for an overnight companion. He was trying to figure out what the guy's angle was. Turns out, in the game, a night companion is a real thing. It's an actual job. Hans seemed relieved to hear that. He invited Bjorn to stay with him, explaining that he had been thinking it was something else. The guy admitted that hearing it in person made it sound kind of perverted. Bjorn agreed to stay. He introduced himself as Bjorn, the son of Jandel, trying to sound as barbarian-like as possible. Hans said he would just call him Bjorn. He added that it was best to have 3 night companions, but he didn't want to waste time looking for another one. Hans wondered why the 2 of them didn't just spend the night together. He immediately realized how that sounded, and he looked absolutely mortified. Hans thought there was something strange about Bjorn's way of speaking. He couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, but something felt off. Bjorn suggested that they play rock, paper, scissors to decide who would get to sleep first. The barbarian seemed pretty confident about his chances. That's how they decided to spend their first night together in the labyrinth. Hans immediately realized how weird that sounded. Hans was happy because he won. He asked if that meant he could sleep first. Bjorn reluctantly agreed. The big guy knew he was going to lose because he had no luck. Hans told Bjorn to take the item, explaining that it was a watch. He said that the barbarian could use it to wake him up when the shorthand reached a certain spot. He held up the watch, which looked pretty old school, with Roman numerals. Hans figured that Bjorn probably didn't even know how to read time anyway. Hans asked if Bjorn understood what he was saying. He offered to explain it again, but was clearly getting annoyed. He was thinking, what the hell? Hans figured that was probably how most people saw barbarians, in dungeon and stone. They just assumed they were all dumb. Bjorn looked at the watch and thought it looked pretty expensive. It felt like trash to him, but he was sure there would come a time when he could use it to his advantage. Hans was sleeping soundly, completely comfortable. Bjorn watched him, wondering if that was what an experienced adventurer was like. Bjorn wondered if Hans would even lend him his sleeping bag if he asked. He was really getting tired of just sitting there. Bjorn complained that it was so boring, since there weren't any goblins or adventurers around, though he admitted that it was convenient. Bjorn glanced at the watch Hans had given him, thinking that time needed to hurry up. He was so ready to get some sleep. The hands on the watch were slowly inching closer to the mark. He was really looking forward to getting some shut-eye. Bjorn woke Hans up, telling him to get up. He was making sure that Hans was awake and ready to take over watch duty. Hans answered that nothing had happened while Bjorn was sleeping. The man seemed all right, though Bjorn was still a little suspicious. Bjorn told Hans that he should get some sleep too, and that he'd wake him up in 2 hours. The barbarian seemed to be in a good mood. Bjorn thought to himself that there was no way he could rest. He was too on edge to be able to fall asleep. The young warrior knew he couldn't let his guard down. He had a bad feeling about the dungeon. Hans noticed that Bjorn hadn't broken the bottle. He was already suspicious of the guy, thinking to himself, how can I trust someone I just met? At the same time, loud snores filled the air. Bjorn was already asleep. The big guy was out cold, covered in blood. He looked completely exhausted. Bjorn continued to snore. He was sleeping like a savage who'd had a long day. Hans watched him. His eyes narrowed. He hoped Bjorn wouldn't notice that he was still awake. Hans watched Bjorn sleeping and thought to himself that barbarians were a funny species. He figured that his act was working like a charm. It was easy to see what they were thinking, since they assumed that barbarians were simpletons. Hans continued to watch the sleeping Bjorn. He thought, Alright, the dumb barbarian is sleeping like a log. Hans was still wide awake and thought that since he was so open, he was sure Bjorn would act if he had ulterior motives. The guy was ready to catch him in the act. Suddenly, a voice boomed, demanding that someone show themselves. Bjorn suddenly stood up, looming over Hans. The big guy declared that he didn't sleep a wink. Bjorn was wide awake, thinking that for 2 hours, the other guy didn't do anything. He was starting to get annoyed. Hans was sleeping soundly. He thought to himself that he should have slept, questioning what the hell he was doing. But there was no way Bjorn would let his guard down so easily around a complete stranger. The barbarian couldn't sleep until he decided if Hans was trustworthy. Bjorn was starting to feel like he was going to die from fatigue. The poor guy looked exhausted. He couldn't fall asleep. The warrior's eyes were wide open, staring into the darkness. Bjorn suddenly shouted. He looked absolutely furious, his face contorted in anger. Hans was standing next to Bjorn, touching him with a smile. The barbarian looked exhausted, covered in blood and dirt. Bjorn started to speak, pausing mid-sentence. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Bjorn insisted that he wasn't sleeping. He told the other guy to wipe the drool off his own face first. Hans apologized, saying it was all right, and thankfully nothing happened while he was sleeping, so he wouldn't say much. But Bjorn was still looking at him with suspicion. Bjorn thanked him. He offered to stand guard if Hans wanted to sleep more. Bjorn's face was still brutal, and he looked pretty intense. He was clearly on edge, even after the fight. Hans insisted that he was all right. He told Bjorn that he looked tired and should sleep, since it was his turn to stand guard. Bjorn looked at him. He just said thanks. Hans suddenly asked if he was maybe looking for an overnight companion. He added that he seemed nice, and his name was Hans. Hans thought back to how Bjorn had spoken to him first when he was in a tough spot. He also didn't blame him for falling asleep. He was really starting to like this guy. Hans considered that Bjorn had said it was all right, and thankfully nothing happened while he was sleeping, so he wouldn't say much. Plus, he refused to be compensated for his mistake. Hans was really impressed. Bjorn was lying down, exhausted. He was thinking about the game he knew, Dungeon and Stone. Bjorn realized that in the game, there was no one this nice. He was clicking through his memories, trying to figure it out. The words appeared on the screen. That is this nice. Bjorn started to wonder if Hans was playing some kind of trick. Hans looked up at Bjorn, who was already awake. He asked if he was up. Hans wanted to know why he didn't sleep longer. Bjorn was already holding his hammer, a small smile on his face. The big guy looked like he was ready to get back to work. Bjorn was still lying down, covered in blood. He looked pretty beat up, but he was still smiling. Bjorn didn't waste any time. He swung his weapon with incredible force, the blow carrying enough power to crush stone. The impact sent shockwaves through the air. The enemy took the full force of the attack. He cried out in pain as the blow landed, staggering backward from the sheer power. The enemy was stunned. He stammered, pointing out that Bjorn had dodged the attack. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Bjorn glared at the enemy, his eyes filled with rage. The warrior was covered in blood, but he seemed unfazed, ready for another attack. The enemy started to speak, trying to get Bjorn to listen. He wondered if the guy was trying to make up some kind of excuse. The guy on the ground was trying to crawl away, clearly regretting his life choices. He shouted, wondering how stupid he could have been. Bjorn didn't give him a chance to escape. He swung his weapon down with full force, the sound of the impact echoing through the dungeon. The man coughed up blood, his face contorted in pain. He was shocked by the power of the blow, asking if Bjorn thought he was a barbarian. Bjorn stood over his fallen opponent, towering over him. The guy was still trying to explain himself, but it was clear he was running out of time. Bjorn thought to himself that the guy didn't die with one hit, unlike the goblins. He realized he needed to strike him one more time to finish the job. Bjorn brought his shield down on the guy while yelling that he was going to smash him. The force of the blow looked absolutely devastating. The impact sent the guy flying through the air. He was completely helpless, unable to do anything to stop himself. The guy landed hard on the ground and tried to catch his breath. He was clearly in a lot of pain. Bjorn stood over the guy, his shadow looming over him. The enemy started begging for forgiveness. The guy pleaded with Bjorn to let him live, his voice trembling with fear. He was desperate to escape the situation. The injured man looked up, his face covered in blood. He was asked why he had done it, looking nervous and scared. The guy stuttered, trying to explain that he only wanted Bjorn's magic crystals. He claimed he was just going to knock him out and take them. The injured man was asked if he was really going to kill a barbarian for a few magic crystals. He admitted that he was also after Bjorn's shield, since barbarian equipment sells for a good price. The man was then asked if that was really all. He started begging to be let go, looking up with hopeful eyes. Bjorn didn't buy it for a second, realizing that the guy was still hiding something. He struck the guy hard, leaving the guy gasping for air. Bjorn stood over the injured man, his foot pressed against his chest. He told him that this was the last time to be honest, looking down with cold eyes. The injured man was reminded that killing another adventurer in Dungeon and Stone was a serious crime. Bjorn pressed him to reveal the real reason he attacked, focusing on his heart. The guy looked up, clearly confused by the question. He asked what Bjorn meant, his eyes wide with fear. The injured man started talking, admitting that barbarian hearts were being sold for a high price. He was trying to justify his actions, but his voice trembled. Turns out, they were being used as ingredients for a new spell. The heart glowed with an eerie light, surrounded by a strange, magic circle. Bjorn realized something about the situation. He finally understood the other guy's point of view. To that man, Bjorn was just another monster to kill. He was nothing more than a goblin in his eyes. He was tough to catch, like a slippery fish. The goblins were all around him, but he was too strong for them. But he was precious enough to give a big reward if someone managed to take him down. As a result, Bjorn wondered why the guy had waited until now to attack. Bjorn pressed the man against the wall, asking why he didn't attack when he was asleep. He added that he needed to sleep too, looking down at the man with a serious expression. The man on the ground tried to justify himself. He said he was just a pest, but an effective one. He asked if Bjorn would forgive him since he had told him everything. Bjorn looked down at the man, his expression unreadable. The barbarian was covered in blood, but seemed completely unfazed. A sinister smile crept across Bjorn's face. He looked like he was enjoying the situation way too much. The man on the ground looked up, waiting for an answer. Bjorn asked if he really thought he would forgive him. He added that he would probably run into more people like him, and they would all say the same thing. Bjorn continued, asking if the man really thought he was going to. The rest of his sentence was cut off. Bjorn stared down at the man with cold eyes, covered in blood. He asked if he was supposed to forgive people like him every single time. The man on the ground looked up, terrified. He quickly denied it, saying he wasn't like those other people at all. The man begged for his life, trying to bargain with Bjorn. He offered to give him everything he had. He pleaded, saying he didn't have much right now, but he would give him everything once he got back to the city. He begged Bjorn to give him just one more chance. He promised that Bjorn wouldn't regret it. But little did he know, it had only been one day since the barbarian entered this game world. The man's hand lay limp on the ground, surrounded by a pool of blood. The scene was gruesome, showing the finality of what just happened. Bjorn stood tall, covered in blood. He muttered to himself that he had killed a man. The system notified him that he had accomplished an achievement, his first murder. As a reward, his mental stats would increase by 1. 2 days had passed since Bjorn entered the game. The system informed him that he had equipped a shoulder pad, increasing his overall item levels by 13. Bjorn was now carrying a backpack, which increased his inventory limit. He also equipped a hammer and leather boots, which increased his overall item levels by 30 and 5 respectively. Bjorn thought about how he had graduated from living like a savage. He had started drinking water from his bottle when he was thirsty. He also used his compass when he needed to know which direction to go. The barbarian looked at his pocket watch when he wanted to know the time, and he could even treat injuries with bandages and potions. Bjorn thought about how ironic it was, and then he said that it was only when he killed a man that he was able to start living like a man. He walked away into the darkness. Bjorn checked his stats again. He saw that his mental stat had increased by 1, and his item level had jumped to 72. His overall combat index was now 81. Bjorn swung his hammer with incredible force. The goblin didn't stand a chance, disappearing in a cloud of dust after the powerful hit. Bjorn thought about how the goblin disappeared with just one hit of his hammer. He wondered if he should have chosen weapons from the start. He didn't know he'd be so good at fighting back then. Bjorn stood in the cave, his back to the viewer. 2 goblins stood before him, ready to attack. The tension in the air was thick. Bjorn realized that since it was the second day, the goblins had started appearing in pairs. He gripped his weapon tighter, ready for the fight. Bjorn thought his battle stats had gone up thanks to his new weapon. 2 goblins approached him, looking angry and ready to fight. Bjorn kept punching the goblins. The force of each blow was enough to make them disappear in a flash of light. Bjorn continued his relentless assault. He thought to himself that his progress was going smoothly so far. Bjorn knelt down, looking around at the crystals scattered on the ground. The scene was covered in blood. Bjorn was starting to feel the strain. He thought that he was going to die from fatigue, since he had been battling goblins non-stop since meeting Hans. He knew he wouldn't last much longer and needed to sleep soon. Bjorn mused that he might not have an overnight companion, but he figured he might be better off alone anyway. Bjorn stood there, looking down at the ground. He was thinking that getting stabbed by the goblins' daggers would be safer than what he was about to face. Bjorn's face was filled with anger. He cursed under his breath, clearly frustrated by the situation. Suddenly, a couple of goblins appeared, holding their daggers. Bjorn complained that the scumbags decided to show up as soon as he started to doze off. Bjorn yelled at the goblins, his face red with fury. He was pissed that they showed up after only 10 minutes. Everything went silent. A big question mark appeared, showing the confusion. Suddenly, there was a huge explosion. The force of it shook the entire area, leaving nothing but dust and debris. Bjorn's back muscles tensed as he spoke. He was saying that he had killed everyone he could see. Bjorn was lying down, looking exhausted. He begged them to stop showing up, wishing he could just get a little bit of sleep. Turns out, the game system announced that Bjorn had been attacked by a goblin while he was sleeping. The little scumbag was right there, ready to stab him. Bjorn's eyes snapped open, filled with rage. He couldn't believe he hadn't sensed the goblin at all, and he was about to explode with fury. Suddenly, there was another explosion, and the attacker screamed like crazy. The force of the blast sent debris flying everywhere. The goblin looked absolutely terrified. He was running away as fast as he could, clearly regretting his decision to attack Bjorn. Bjorn's face was filled with rage. He was panting heavily, but he was ready for the next challenger. Bjorn stood over the goblin, looking down with cold eyes. He was ready to end this fight quickly. Bjorn told the goblin to get lost. He didn't even have the energy to chase after the little scumbag. Bjorn coughed, realizing how close he had come to dying. He thought that if he was any shorter, or if the goblin was able to jump higher, he would have been stabbed in the throat. He realized he almost didn't sense the goblin. Bjorn knew he needed to rest properly. First, he had to treat the wound. Bjorn winced in pain as he poured the potion on the wound. He wondered how it was that healing with the potion hurt more than being stabbed. It had been 14 hours since Bjorn left Hans. He figured it was about time people started looking for overnight companions, but he realized he couldn't trust anyone now that he knew how valuable barbarian hearts were. Bjorn thought that if it was a fellow barbarian, he could trust them. He seemed relieved at the thought. Bjorn thought that he needed to find another barbarian. He had to find someone he could trust. Bjorn was approached by two humans who asked if he was looking for an overnight companion. They were clearly trying to get him to join them. More humans approached, asking if he wanted to join them since he looked tired. They seemed to be trying to take advantage of him. The humans insisted that he would be the third one. They added that since he was a barbarian, they could trust him, unlike yesterday. Bjorn replied that he was looking for another barbarian. The young man realized that covered in blood and missing a shoe, he wouldn't have looked like a good choice for an overnight companion. The human heard Bjorn say that he was looking for another barbarian. He said that was going to be tough and asked suspiciously why Bjorn was looking for one. The human explained that there were probably less than 100 barbarians on the first floor. He added that they would have ascended within 2 to 3 months as soon as they had their coming-of-age ceremony. Bjorn thought to himself that it must be laughable for him to be struggling on the first floor with such a large build. He felt a little embarrassed. The human wished Bjorn well, saying, "May Lapdonia protect you on your journey." Bjorn thanked him politely. The young warrior then wondered if he had to give up on finding another barbarian. Bjorn thought to himself that it didn't matter if it was a barbarian or not. He realized he just needed to find an overnight companion, period. Bjorn thought to himself that he needed someone who wasn't human. His eyes narrowed as he considered his options. He continued walking, thinking it had to be another species. The young warrior figured that there were less humans than other species, but more than barbarians. He went on, thinking that it didn't matter as long as they were another species. Bjorn reasoned that since most other species had special traits, unlike humans, they wouldn't harm other adventurers being blinded by chump change like humans. Bjorn's eye twitched slightly, showing his determination. He was set on finding someone reliable. After making that decision, he roamed the cave for about an hour. Bjorn looked up and saw someone sitting on a ledge above. He was surprised to see her there. The elf looked absolutely terrified. She was shivering, clearly scared of something. The elf's eyes widened as she noticed Bjorn. She looked like she was about to run. Turns out, he had found an injured elf. This could be useful. Bjorn looked at the elf and asked if she was alone. He wanted to know if there were any other threats nearby. The elf was super on guard. It made sense, since anyone would be intimidated by a big barbarian when they were injured and all alone. The elf was hurt on her stomach, and it didn't look like she was stabbed by a goblin dagger. Bjorn looked down at her and asked if a human had hurt her. He was trying to figure out what had happened. Bjorn started walking toward her. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the cave, making the elf even more nervous. The elf begged for help, calling him Mister. She looked up at Bjorn with pleading eyes, hoping he would show her some mercy. Bjorn looked confused by her reaction. He hadn't expected her to beg like this. At the same time, The elf kept begging him to let her go, calling him a barbarian. Bjorn thought to himself that he was surprised. What the hell? What kind of elf has no backbone? He had assumed that she would be cold, like the elves in the game. He realized that he would have approached her differently if he had known her personality. The warrior decided to get rid of the misunderstanding by giving her a smile. Bjorn reassured her, telling her not to worry. He was hoping to calm her down and gain her trust. Bjorn was smiling, trying to look friendly. At the same time, the elf was staring up at him, probably trying to figure out what he was planning. Bjorn told her that he had no intention of killing her, but the word liar appeared on the screen, so he was definitely lying. Erwin begged him to let her live, just this once. She was clearly terrified of what he might do to her. Bjorn wondered what the hell all barbarians do. He was starting to get annoyed. Bjorn was thinking about why she was so intimidated by just one sentence. He thought, what the hell is with their image? Bjorn suggested that she should treat her wound first, and they could talk later. Erwin looked at the bandages in surprise, wondering what they were. Bjorn knew that those were lyco leaves. He had been worried that they were poisonous, but now he knew that she could use them safely. Erwin asked him why he was giving her those. She looked confused, wondering what his angle was. Bjorn said that there must be a reason to help someone. He thought to himself that there definitely was a reason. Bjorn told her that he would stand guard so she could treat her wound. The barbarian wanted to become overnight companions with the elf. Bjorn thought to himself that it might sound bad, but it wasn't exactly the worst situation for her either. He was trying to figure out the best way to approach her. Erwin was injured and fatigued. She had been through a lot, and it was starting to show. Bjorn knew that Erwin was in a much worse situation than he was. The barbarian knew that she had a beautiful appearance. She finished treating her wound. Erwin had cleaned and bandaged it as best she could. Bjorn thought to himself that she seemed to be less guarded now. He figured that they should probably make their introductions now. The young man was ready to start talking. Bjorn decided to formally introduce himself, trying to ease the tension. He stated that his name was Bjorn, the son of Jandal. Erwin seemed a little surprised by his sudden formality. The elf quietly responded with her own name, barely above a whisper. Bjorn wondered why she was so afraid of him. The barbarian asked if it was because he was a barbarian and she was an elf. He tilted his head, confused by the situation. The scene flashed to a battle between elves and barbarians. The two groups were locked in a brutal conflict, each side fighting with savage intensity. The flashback continued, showing the deep-seated hostility between the two races. It was clear that there was a lot of bad blood between them, and it wasn't going to be easy to overcome that. Bjorn seemed to be getting a little annoyed. He stated that it was relevant to the conversation they were having. The barbarian continued, saying that this was the first time he was hearing about the hostile relationship between elves and barbarians. He thought they had good relations in the game before. Erwin stammered nervously, denying everything. The elf insisted that the war ended 10 years ago, and that she harbored no ill will towards barbarians. Erwin insisted that she didn't want to fight Bjorn. She wondered how much time had passed from the game that he was aware of. Either way, the woman said that she had no time to find anyone else right now. Erwin seemed relieved that Bjorn didn't harbor ill will either. She asked if that was so, her face lighting up with hope. Bjorn looked down at Erwin. He asked if she wanted to be his overnight companion. The barbarian seemed serious, but the question was still kind of weird. Erwin seemed surprised by the question. She said that she was really tired and suggested that they just cooperate for today. The elf looked like she was trying to avoid something. Erwin looked shocked, her eyes widening. She seemed to be thinking hard about something. The woman was definitely nervous. Erwin hesitated for a moment. She then asked if he could swear on his warrior's honor that he wouldn't hurt her. The girl looked up at him with pleading eyes. Bjorn looked thoughtful for a second. He said that he would swear on the name of his tribe. The barbarian admitted that he didn't really care about warrior's honor, but he could use it from time to time. Bjorn looked at Erwin. He told her that he wanted to go over something first. The barbarian seemed serious, like he was about to explain something important. Bjorn looked annoyed. He said that he wasn't Mr., but Bjorn, the son of Jandal. The young man seemed to be correcting her on his name. He continued speaking. Bjorn insisted that he was only 20 years old. The warrior seemed to be emphasizing his youth. Bjorn looked determined. He swore upon his warrior's honor. The barbarian seemed to be making a serious promise. Erwin looked equally determined. She swore upon the name of her tribe. The elf seemed to be returning the promise in kind. Bjorn vowed not to harm the other party during the night, promising and swearing it. He could finally get some sleep after all this. Erwin seemed relieved to hear that. Erwin told him that she would sleep first, figuring that he would prefer that too. Bjorn looked at her, thinking that wasn't exactly what he wanted, but if she wanted to, he would let her. The elf seemed to be trying to take advantage of his offer. Bjorn gave her a pocket watch, warning her that it was expensive and she should handle it with care. Erwin looked surprised, but promised that she would be careful. The barbarian seemed to be trying to make her feel more comfortable. Bjorn thought to himself how difficult it was to get some sleep, but since he never knew, he would pretend to sleep for about 10 minutes. The warrior was still on guard, even after making the promise. But Erwin suddenly called out to him, interrupting his thoughts. The young woman seemed to need something urgently. Bjorn's eye snapped open, alert and ready for anything. Erwin suddenly woke up, asking what time it was and saying it had been hours. She immediately handed Bjorn back his watch, looking a little flustered. Bjorn wondered when he had fallen asleep, since he couldn't even pretend to snore. He thought that it must be the synergy of the blanket and backpack that made him so sleepy. Bjorn figured he should let her borrow those things too. He told Erwin that she could cover herself with the blanket. If she wanted, she could also use it as a pillow. Erwin seemed happy and told him that she would use them well, thanking him for the offer. She looked relieved to have something to keep her warm. Erwin fell asleep as soon as her head hit the ground. She looked peaceful and relaxed, finally getting some rest. Bjorn figured that Erwin must have been tired as well, since her day was probably as tiring as his. He was starting to feel bad for the elf. Bjorn sat down, thinking it felt like it had been 5 days, but it had only been 3. He figured that since he had all these useless thoughts in his head, he was probably feeling better. At least he wasn't bored. Bjorn wondered what had happened to him in real life, asking himself if he had been reported as missing. He figured it probably hadn't been reported yet, since who would even come visit him anyway? He looked sad as he thought about his old life. Bjorn told himself to stop thinking about it. He was starting to get depressed. Bjorn figured that even if he were to go back, there was nothing there for him. He knew that if he kept thinking about it that way, his willpower was going to break. After a few more turns of standing guard, it was time to get going. He stood up, ready to move. At the top, the pocket watch showed the time ticking down. Meanwhile, Bjorn was still lying down, thinking that there were only 10 minutes left. Bjorn was silent as he stared off into space. He started to wonder about something. Bjorn was considering something as he watched the elf sleep. He wondered if he should ask her again. Bjorn thought that since she was an elf, she would be helpful in battle. He figured she could pull her weight. Bjorn thought that if they became allies, he would need to split the rewards with her, which would decrease his share. But the goblins had been appearing in swarms since 3 days ago, so he was conflicted. Bjorn was thinking about whether it made more sense to get some safe sleep or to go find more magic crystals. He was trying to decide what was more logical. At that moment, Bjorn was being watched by 2 people. They were walking through the cave towards him, but he didn't notice them yet. One of the men asked if that was the elf. The other man thought it was her, saying that the bow and arrow looked the same. The man asked the barbarian what his relationship was with the elf. He seemed very curious. Bjorn told him that they were overnight companions, as he could probably tell. The man found it fascinating that a barbarian and an elf could be companions. He then asked how much time was left. Bjorn looked down at the men with pure anger. He told them that he had no obligation to respond to them. At the bottom, one of the men looked nervous, while the other smirked. The man smirked, a bead of sweat dripping down his face. He simply replied that he understood. The 2 men turned around and ran away. They were clearly trying to get out of there as fast as possible. Bjorn stared after them, a worried expression on his face. He had a bad feeling about this, thinking that they were definitely looking for Erwin. Bjorn looked down at Erwin. He seemed concerned about what was going to happen next. Erwin was still sleeping soundly. She mumbled that she wanted just 5 more minutes. Bjorn looked absolutely furious. He said that she was about to get screwed, but she still wanted to sleep. Bjorn tried to wake Erwin up. He told her to get up immediately, his voice firm. Erwin just mumbled in response. She was clearly still half asleep. Bjorn realized that she was pretending to be asleep. He noticed that the blanket, which had been loose before, was now covering her face completely. Erwin suddenly screamed. The young woman was clearly startled by something. Bjorn asked her why she was pretending to be asleep. She stammered, saying that if she got up. Erwin looked up at Bjorn with tears in her eyes. She thought he was going to desert her. The elf was clearly afraid of being left alone. Bjorn realized that was what she was worried about. He thought to himself that they weren't official allies, just temporary overnight companions. The warrior considered it a relationship maintained by standing guard while the other person slept for one night. Bjorn thought that as soon as she opened her eyes, their oath would end. He wondered what had happened with those 2 guys. The young man was curious about what they knew. Erwin immediately denied that anything had happened. She looked surprised by the question. The elf seemed flustered. Bjorn asked how they knew her. He figured they were probably from the same clan as the human who had tried to hurt her. The barbarian was suspicious. Erwin noticed that the symbol on the garments of the men they encountered were the same. She realized that they were called the Crystal Union. The elf seemed concerned by this information. Bjorn realized that it wasn't just a couple of guys, but an entire group after her. He thought the situation was getting much worse. The barbarian considered parting ways with the elf and getting going, but then he looked at her. He was anxious because the elf was only 20 years old. The warrior felt a pang of guilt. Bjorn sighed. He decided that they should talk while they were moving. The young man seemed to have made a decision. Erwin asked if he was going to help her. She added that she would hear his story first before she decided. The elf looked hopeful. Erwin agreed that she would listen while they moved, since they were behind schedule. The elf looked happy to finally be doing something. Erwin started to tell her story. She had met them on her first day inside the labyrinth as overnight companions. The young woman explained that she had sensed something strange, so she opened her eyes while she was asleep, trying to figure out what was going on. Bjorn was standing over her. He asked if she was awake, sounding a little concerned. The barbarian told her that she could sleep a bit more. He seemed to be trying to be nice for once. Erwin explained that she only found out later that he was the manager of a clan that did business on the first floor. They were running as she spoke, trying to get away. The elf managed to escape somehow, but the people from his group kept attacking her. That's when she got hurt, she said, looking down a little. Bjorn, who had been listening intently, asked how they had attacked her. He looked a little confused. Erwin thought that they used message stones to keep chasing her. The young woman explained that message stones didn't exist in the game she played, and she needed more details about them. She explained that message stones were mystic devices that allowed people to talk to each other when they were linked. Their range was about 300 meters, she added. It was like they had walkie-talkies, the voice in the bubble thought. They had nowhere to run, lots of people, and mystic devices that let them talk to each other. Bjorn's face was set in determination. He realized that if he left Erwin, she would be caught for sure. Bjorn asked why the members of the Crystal Union were still chasing her, since it didn't seem like she had done anything wrong. He looked at her questioningly. Erwin looked a little scared. She wondered if they were trying to shut her up, but she didn't think that was the only reason. Erwin explained that when she was escaping the first time, she flung her knife around, and it happened to. Bjorn charged forward, thinking he had hit the guy somewhere bad. He was ready to keep fighting if he had to. Bjorn looked confused and asked what she meant by somewhere bad. He was curious about what she was implying. Erwin stammered, trying to explain what she meant. She was a little embarrassed to say it directly. Erwin giggled as she revealed that she had heard it was completely lost. She continued, saying that the guy couldn't even attach it back with potions. Bjorn looked at her with disbelief. He exclaimed that that was more than enough of a reason to chase her, calling her an idiot. He was shocked that she was laughing about it. Erwin giggled nervously and said that it could be called karma. Bjorn looked at her with a slightly concerned expression, wondering what she was implying. Erwin spoke up, telling the barbarian that someone was following them and that he shouldn't look behind him. She seemed pretty serious about it. Erwin continued, saying that the person was about 150 meters behind them. She looked focused, trying to pinpoint the exact location. Bjorn and Erwin started running faster. He thought that the distance was far enough that he wouldn't sense anything, but it didn't seem like she was lying. Bjorn asked if she was good with increasing their speed. Erwin quickly replied yes, but added a "for now" at the end, sounding a little unsure. Erwin kept running, even though her wound had reopened. She didn't complain, showing her determination. Bjorn thought to himself that she had insides. The elf was pushing herself, even in this terrible condition. Erwin reported that the distance between them and the person chasing them was still about 150 meters. She sounded a little worried. Bjorn noticed that even though they were running faster, the distance wasn't increasing. He looked frustrated, realizing they weren't getting away. He figured that the person chasing them was probably telling their friends where they were. The barbarian knew that was going to be a big problem. The decision was made. They had to get rid of the people chasing them. Bjorn figured that if he were the target, he would have already made the same decision. He looked serious, gripping his hammer tightly. Bjorn knew that if they killed the scumbag, there was no going back. He had to think about the risks. Erwin wanted to know what the benefits were. She stammered, asking Bjorn for more information so she could make a good decision. Bjorn turned to Erwin, asking her what she was good at. He needed to know her strengths. Erwin told Bjorn that she was good at laundry and cleaning, but not at cooking. Bjorn looked at her, confused, and asked her what she was talking about. Erwin realized that Bjorn was asking about her skills in battle. She laughed nervously, correcting herself that she meant during battle. The elf proudly declared that she was good at archery. She seemed happy to finally have something useful to contribute. Erwin then added that she could also use spirit magic, specifically the flame element. She showed off her power, conjuring a small flame. Bjorn thought to himself that she was the perfect example of an elf archer. He also realized that the flame element was the rare rarest one. He looked impressed. The question hung in the air. Had she ever taken a life before? Erwin looked up, her expression unreadable. A shadow fell over her face as she thought about the question. Below, her hand tightened around her bow, but she answered simply, denying any past kills. But she hesitated. Something was clearly bothering her. She declared that she could do it, whatever it was. Bjorn looked up at the elf, considering her words. He finally spoke her name, grabbing her attention. Bjorn was making her an offer. He asked if she wanted to be his comrade. Bjorn continued, laying out the terms of their deal. He'd get 9 shares of the profit, and she'd get 1, and that was final. And immediately, Erwin agreed to his terms. Her face flushed. Bjorn seemed satisfied with her answer. He asked how far away their pursuers were. The reply came back, 100 meters. The voice on the other end sounded stressed. He said they were running as fast as they could, but the Crystal Union was still gaining on them. The voice paused, thinking out loud. He suggested that they stop running. Bjorn told Erwin that they were going to veer off. He ordered her to summon the spirit right now. He looked focused and determined. Erwin agreed to do it. She started to summon the spirit, her face showing concentration. A small fire spirit appeared next to her. Erwin thought to herself that she couldn't believe she was back here on her own. She felt their pursuers getting closer. The small spirit floated between her and Bjorn. Erwin then canceled the summon. She looked a bit nervous, but she followed Bjorn's instructions. The fire spirit disappeared. Bjorn and Erwin continued moving through the cave. The air was tense, and they knew their pursuers were close. They had to be careful. Someone realized that the pursuers had come in, even though they couldn't see. They stopped right by them, which was bad news. Bjorn remained under the blanket, pretending to be asleep. As he stayed still, he figured that the pursuers must have some proper tracking methods to find them. Erwin spoke his name, probably to get his attention. She looked at him with a worried expression. Erwin's face was shown in a close-up. The elf looked determined, like she was about to do something. Erwin drew her bow, ready to fire. She whispered that she was going to shoot. Erwin aimed her bow with deadly focus. She was ready to fire at a moment's notice. Her eyes narrowed in concentration, and immediately, the arrow flew, striking one of the pursuers right in the head. Blood splattered as the arrow found its mark. Blood dripped down from above, splattering onto Bjorn and Erwin. The two of them stood there, looking up at the body above. Erwin looked up, her face a mixture of shock and relief. She hadn't expected to actually hit the guy, but she did what she had to do. Bjorn told her that she did well. He added that if she had hesitated, they would have both been in danger. A man knelt over a body, his expression grim. He looked closely at the person lying on the ground, who was clearly dead. The kneeling man held up a small device, trying to make contact. He called out the name Serdin, hoping for a response. The man shouted into the device, desperate to get through. He reported that Serdin was out of contact and had been chasing the elf and the barbarian. He was clearly worried. An intense voice ordered everyone to gather at the Goblin District. The urgency in the voice was impossible to ignore. Bjorn sat down, looking a bit disappointed. He said that if it was Serdin, he was hoping there would be some decent loot, but there wasn't much to see. The loot consisted of a hefty pouch of magic crystals, 2 daggers, and 1 potion bottle from his waist belt. It wasn't much, but it was something. Bjorn then mentioned the clothes Serdin was wearing. He added that he had changed into them, but it felt a bit weird. Erwin replied that the leather top and bottom would be much better than the rags he was wearing before. She seemed pleased with the change. Erwin thought that since her clothes changed, her aura did too. She looked thoughtful, considering the implications. Erwin mentioned it was a good thing. She then asked Bjorn how to use the message stone. The elf figured there had to be a button somewhere on the side, and just like that, someone pressed a button on the side of the message stone. It seemed like it was now activated. The message stone crackled to life, and a man's voice boomed out. He repeated that Serdin, who had been chasing the elf, was defeated. The guy added that the elf was hiding in the Goblin District with a barbarian who used a hammer and shield. Erwin's eyes went wide as she heard the message. She stammered, clearly terrified by what she was hearing. Bjorn reassured Erwin, telling her not to worry. He told her to summon the spirit, as they were going to travel along the outskirts to stay safe. Erwin told Bjorn that they were going to the 2nd floor. She sounded a little nervous as she asked, "What?" Bjorn continued walking forward. He didn't seem to care about Erwin's reaction as he kept moving. Erwin asked Bjorn if they were really going to the 2nd floor by themselves. She seemed a little unsure about the whole plan. Bjorn looked at Erwin. He simply said that was right, confirming their destination. Erwin mentioned that the 1st and 2nd floors were completely different. She asked if Bjorn knew that. The big guy responded that he was aware of the difference. Bjorn told Erwin that they would be alright if they stayed near the entrance. He thought that they were a pretty good match, actually. Erwin looked up, surprised by what she heard. She stammered, asking if they were were a good match, blushing as she did. Bjorn explained that a melee tanker and a long-range dealer had always been a good match. He added that if he was going to form a party with Erwin, the first floor wasn't going to give them enough profit. Erwin looked worried. She said that this was their first time, so how could they go to the second floor already? It felt as if they were going into an orc lair to avoid goblins. Someone shouted that if they found the elf scumbag, they would give them first dibs on enjoying her, on top of the 10,000 gold. Erwin gasped, clearly disgusted by the offer. Erwin looked at Bjorn and told him not to worry. She wasn't going to leave him. She seemed determined to stick with him, no matter what. But the man interrupted them, saying that it was a pretty good deal. He wondered if the elf was too resistant. Could he cut off one of her arms and legs? He added to make sure to leave the important bits, laughing like a maniac. Erwin looked terrified, but she said that she would go to the second floor. She seemed to be forcing herself to agree. Bjorn thought to himself that was good timing. He realized that he didn't need to convince her anymore. Bjorn thought that he always liked helping those in need. He added that it was only when it was beneficial to him, of course. Bjorn was walking with Erwin, thinking to himself. He thought that if he could screw over such disgusting trash, it would be great. At the same time, Erwin looked down, unsure about what to do. Bjorn continued thinking to himself that he would have the self-satisfaction of doing good. Bjorn was holding his bag tightly, still thinking. He thought that it would be the best of both worlds, and there was no reason not to help. Erwin looked at Bjorn and asked him if he even knew how to get to the second floor. She added that she didn't know the exact path, but if they kept heading north, they would get there eventually. Bjorn explained that the dungeon was designed in such a way that if you kept following the darkness, you would reach a portal. He said that the darkness represented a path that led you to the upper floors. Erwin called out to the Barbarian, telling him to wait. She seemed to have noticed something he hadn't, and immediately, the elf pointed out that there was a goblin trap right in front of them. It was hard to see in the dim light, but there it was. Bjorn thought to himself that the traps were appearing pretty late. He had only walked a few steps before stepping on one. He wondered if it was because goblins didn't appear frequently in the light. He was trying to figure out the pattern. Bjorn exclaimed that he was really unlucky. He told Erwin that he would handle it, and she could take a break. The big guy seemed annoyed. Erwin told the big guy that he better not use the spirit. She added that she needed to save her strength for later. The elf replied, of course, with a smile and a slight blush. She seemed a little too eager to agree. Bjorn thought to himself that it didn't look like she meant of course at all. He wondered how he knew she was planning something, and suddenly, two ghouls appeared, growling menacingly. Erwin gasped, clearly caught off guard by their sudden arrival. The elf didn't hesitate. She immediately fired an arrow, aiming for one of the ghouls. The arrow flew straight and true. Erwin fired another arrow with incredible speed. She was determined to take down the ghouls as quickly as possible, and immediately, a savage kick sent the ghoul flying. The force of the impact echoed through the dark tunnel. The ghoul's face contorted in pain and shock. It was clear the kick hit hard, but another enemy was already on the move. A goblin, sword in hand, growled as it charged forward. At the same time, Erwin aimed her bow again, ready to fire another shot. The elf was focused on the new threat. Meanwhile, the goblin was closing in, its eyes fixed on the elf. The elf stood tall, bow in hand, after the fight. Blood splattered all around her, a testament to her deadly accuracy. Erwin looked at Bjorn with a bright smile. She asked him how she did. Bjorn told her that she did well. He added that she really must be an elf with that kind of archery. The barbarian thought she was more skilled than he initially believed, and her movements were also agile. Bjorn held out his hand, showing the magic crystals they had obtained. The crystals glowed softly in the dim light of the dungeon. Erwin held the crystals, her eyes sparkling. She asked if she got one, and he got 9, right? Erwin smiled brightly, talking about something her younger sibling had been asking her for. She seemed really happy at the thought of getting it for them. Bjorn looked confused as he heard her words. He thought to himself if she was trying to insult him or something. He looked at her suspiciously. The system announced that the bounty on the elf had been raised to 20,000 gold. Erwin looked absolutely shocked by the news. She was clearly worried about the implications. Bjorn reassured her not to worry. He said that no one would search for them in the dark. He added that those guys didn't seem to have the best teamwork either. He seemed confident that they could handle anything. Someone announced that they were relocating to hunt the razor-mane wolves. The message continued, asking if anyone wanted to take a break with them, but it seemed like a lot of people weren't even interested. Bjorn thought things were going too well and that something bad was about to happen because of his bad luck. He was interrupted by something. Erwin yelled for Bjorn, warning him that there were ghouls nearby. She looked terrified. Bjorn looked shocked and asked why there were ghouls here. He knew that on the first floor, different monsters appeared based on the direction you went, and ghouls were supposed to be in the south. The barbarian wondered if they had roamed too far and gotten to the border. He seemed concerned. Erwin looked at Bjorn with a worried expression and asked if she had to fight them by herself. She seemed really scared. Bjorn explained that the experience system in this game was really weird. He added that you only get rewarded the first time you beat a monster of the same kind. Bjorn continued, saying that they needed to beat as many different kinds of monsters as they could to level up. He thought this was actually a good thing. Bjorn told Erwin that he would take the lead. He wanted her to take care of the ones in the back. Bjorn thought that if this was like the game, the ghouls wouldn't attack until they got close enough. He prepared himself for the fight. The ghoul was drooling and looked like it was ready to attack. It was staring right at them. Bjorn was facing a bunch of ghouls, but he was surprisingly calm. He thought to himself that things were going exactly as he expected. Bjorn swung his weapon with incredible force, hitting one of the ghouls. The ghoul went flying backwards, clearly caught off guard. Bjorn stared intently. His eyes narrowed. He was focused on the fight, ready for anything that came his way. He swung his weapon again, putting all his strength into the blow. Bjorn knew that ghouls were stronger and faster than goblins. Bjorn thought that even though the ghouls were stronger, they were still rank 9 monsters. He knew their patterns were simple, making them easier to deal with. Bjorn stared intensely at the ghoul, his expression serious. He wasn't intimidated at all, ready to take on whatever came next. At the same time, Erwin was aiming her bow with a confident smile. She thought that with a trusty comrade, this was going to be easy. A message popped up, showing that they had defeated a ghoul and gained 1 experience point. They kept walking north. Turns out, it took them 3 days to get where they were going. Erwin suddenly stopped. She asked Bjorn what was going on. Erwin pointed at the blood on the ground. She didn't think it was from the goblins, and wondered whose blood it could be. She added that she thought the blood led in the direction they wanted to go. The camera zoomed in on the blood. Bjorn considered what it could be. He started to look worried. Bjorn looked up, his eyes wide. He thought it couldn't be, right? He seemed really nervous about something. The blood trail continued across the floor. A bear trap was visible, suggesting someone had been caught in it. Bjorn stared at the blood trail. He seemed to be contemplating something important, his face unreadable. Bjorn remembered the first place he stepped into in the labyrinth. He focused, trying to recall every detail. He remembered that the portal was right behind it. Bjorn and Erwin stood before the glowing gateway, ready to move on. The scene shifted to a man lying on the ground, defeated. He was clearly in bad shape. Bjorn looked absolutely furious. He shouted, "Are you kidding me right now?" Erwin, seeing Bjorn's anger, immediately apologized. She said she was sorry for whatever was happening. Bjorn was furious, realizing the portal was so close to where he started. He shouted that this was insane, wondering how he could have such bad luck. Erwin looked up at him, worried. She asked if she had done something wrong, clearly nervous about his reaction. Bjorn quickly reassured her that it wasn't her fault. He told her not to worry about it, trying to calm her down. Erwin looked shocked. She saw the words blood, bread, sandal near her, realizing the expression he was making. Erwin gasped, realizing Bjorn had gone through so much. She wondered if she had finally figured out why he was acting that way from this situation. Erwin clasped her hands together, thinking that Bjorn must have lost a precious comrade there. She was sure they went to heaven, but she immediately dismissed that thought, admitting she didn't believe it. The elf realized she was definitely misunderstanding the situation. Bjorn asked if she was ready to go up. At the same time, Erwin admitted that she was a bit scared, but she didn't think she would die if she stayed with him, mister. She looked at him with a smile. Erwin was ready to go. Meanwhile, Bjorn thought that she had a strange habit of lengthening her sentences. He was clearly annoyed by that. He wondered what he should say. Bjorn told her to go. Erwin agreed. The young man also told her not to plan on dying that easily either. He wasn't going to let that happen. Turns out, they had arrived on the 2nd floor, the Goblin Forest. It was time to see what was waiting for them there. As they stepped through the portal, Bjorn and Erwin were suddenly falling through the air. The world spun around them, and they had no idea where they were going to land. It was nothing like they expected. Erwin looked down at Bjorn with concern, shouting to ask if he was okay. She was worried that something had gone wrong with the teleportation. The elf could only hope he wasn't hurt too badly. Bjorn was lying on the ground, clearly in pain. He said he had been wondering what it would feel like to go through the portal. The young man admitted that it felt like trash. Bjorn explained that it felt like he was chewed up by a frog in a well and then spat out. He was surprised, since he had never teleported through a portal like he was falling before. The warrior wondered why the other girls girls didn't tell him about this. Erwin was smiling. She thought that she had landed perfectly fine, though. The fairy admitted that she was envious of that agility that barbarians didn't have. Bjorn wanted to check out the area first. He asked if this was the northern area of the goblin forest on the second floor. The warrior looked around, trying to figure out where they had landed. Erwin mentioned that there was a portal behind them that would take them back to the first floor at any time. She added that she didn't sense any living being within 50 meters. The fairy was using her skills to survey the area. Turns out, it wasn't going to get any brighter, even if time passed, since they were inside the labyrinth. The darkness was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. Erwin asked if this was really the second floor. She admitted that she had never heard about the second floor being a forest. The young woman was clearly confused by the environment. There were 4 portals on the first floor, and each one led to a different region. This one led to the North Goblin Forest. The place looked dangerous. To the east was the beast's lair. The wolves howled at the moon, ready to tear anyone apart. To the west was the land of the dead. The zombies reached out, craving flesh. To the south were the dark Rocky Mountains. Erwin suddenly remembered something. She explained that wherever they went, it would all lead to the third floor. Bjorn asked what they should do now. He wondered if she knew the way back to the city from the labyrinth. The warrior was hoping she had some kind of plan. Erwin mentioned that they would automatically go back once the labyrinth closed. The fairy looked concerned, like she wasn't sure about that. She was probably worried about being trapped. Mr. explained that the first floor closes after 168 hours, and the second floor after 240. He looked at the portal, getting ready for the next adventure. Once the time runs out, the labyrinth will spit them back into the city. The Crystal Union wouldn't come up here anyway, since they can't even work well together. Sounds like they're not much of a threat. Bjorn decided they would stay on the second floor till the 168 hours were up, and then go back down to the first floor. He seemed to have a plan already. He said they couldn't just stay by the portal all day, so they would explore the place a bit. He was probably itching for some action. Bjorn told Erwin to take the lead. The fairy seemed a little nervous, but she agreed to it anyway. She probably knew more about this place than he did. Erwin looked around at the forest, saying it felt nostalgic to be there. She was really enjoying the vibe of the place. The fairy added that even though she knew there were only monsters around, it still felt a bit like the fairy shrine. She seemed to be in a good mood, despite the danger. Bjorn warned that there were traps around, telling Erwin to try to follow his footsteps. He was being cautious, looking out for any potential dangers. The barbarian pointed out that there was a trap there too. He seemed pretty confident in his ability to spot them. Erwin looked around, saying she didn't see anything. The fairy seemed a little confused. Maybe the traps were hard to spot. Erwin told Bjorn to look over there, under the leaves, and to pay attention. She seemed pretty sure of herself, and immediately, a trap was triggered, kicking up leaves and dust. The sudden movement was a little startling. Erwin asked if it was her detection ability that found the trap. The fairy seemed pretty proud of herself. Bjorn thought to himself that she was suddenly looking pretty reliable. He didn't expect that. Bjorn simply grunted in agreement. The barbarian was still processing the fact that she found a trap. Bjorn told Erwin that she was good at throwing rocks, but there was no need to praise her. He seemed to be trying to downplay her accomplishment. Erwin was surprised and asked if that was it. She seemed a little disappointed by his lack of praise. Bjorn replied that it was always her duty to find the traps. Bjorn told her not to get so excited over something as small as that. He said that she was already a proper explorer. Erwin looked at him with wide eyes, a little surprised by his words. The young woman seemed to be taking his words to heart. Bjorn simply said, "All right." He seemed to be trying to end the conversation there. Bjorn thought that Erwin was easy to control, now that she was a proper explorer. The young man was definitely thinking about how to use her, but something seemed to him. He noticed that there were traps, but he didn't sense any goblins in the area. Bjorn realized that unlike the first floor, having traps didn't mean there would also be goblins. The traps on the second floor were more like a terrain feature than anything else. Bjorn told Erwin to stop with the small talk and focus. He ordered her to go ahead of him. The fairy archer agreed, saying, "Okay." Turns out this place was called the Goblin Forest in the game. Besides the traps, another trait of the Goblin Forest was that the goblins went around in groups of about a dozen. Bjorn knew that sometimes there were mutant goblins who were warriors or archers. He also knew that the farther they went towards the exterior of the forest, the more mutants and high-ranking monsters there would be. The young man was worried about the dangers ahead, but that shouldn't matter, since Bjorn planned on staying close to the portal. He figured that was the safest option for now. The barbarian had a plan. Bjorn thought to himself that they would get rid of all the traps in the surrounding area and begin widening their area of search. He was already thinking about the best way to do it. Bjorn said that if they got into a dangerous situation, they'd run immediately to the first floor. He wanted Erwin to be clear on the escape plan. The warrior was very serious. They widened out their area by removing traps using rocks. Erwin seemed to be doing most of the work. The fairy archer was focused on the task. Bjorn knew it would be a problem if they accidentally stepped on one of the traps while running away. He was thinking ahead to all the possible dangers. Erwin asked if she did well. The fairy archer was excited to get some praise. She told Bjorn that he was good and a proper explorer. Erwin suddenly stopped what she was doing. She looked around carefully, sensing something was off. Erwin looked up with a worried expression. She told Mister that it was a group of goblins. Bjorn asked how many goblins there were. The young woman said she wasn't sure, but there were definitely more than 10. She thought they were about 50 meters away. Erwin noticed that the goblins hadn't seen them yet. She looked a bit relieved, but still worried about what might happen next. She asked what they should do. Bjorn replied immediately that they would fight the goblins. Bjorn asked how close they could get without being seen. He was trying to figure out the best way to approach the goblins without alerting them. Erwin said that she could get about 30 meters away from them on her own. The barbarian warrior understood and said they would do it according to plan. He seemed confident in their strategy. Bjorn thought it was amazing how she didn't make any noise walking through the grass. He figured that was just how fairies were. Erwin spotted a group of goblins walking down a path. She narrowed her eyes, trying to count them and figure out their strength. Bjorn watched as Erwin walked away. He looked serious, knowing that they were about to fight a bunch of goblins. Erwin aimed her bow at the goblins. She was ready to shoot, her hands steady despite the danger. She let the arrow fly. The arrow shot through the air towards the goblins, hoping to catch them by surprise. Bjorn stepped forward, ready to fight. He was eager to smash some goblins. Erwin kept her bow aimed at the goblins in the distance. She wondered if her arrow had hit one of them. She couldn't hear anything because they were too far away. Bjorn shouted at Erwin to get behind him quickly. The young woman responded that she understood. She knew that meant things were about to get serious. Bjorn charged into the group of goblins, swinging his weapon with all his might. The goblins looked scared as the huge man approached, ready to smash them. Bjorn thought to himself that the second floor was definitely different from the first. He looked determined, knowing that they had to be careful. He realized there were 3 times the amount of goblins they would usually find on the first floor. It was rather intimidating, even if they were just goblins. Plus, there was a goblin warrior. It should be scary. Surprisingly enough, Bjorn didn't feel scared at all. He was calm, even though there were a bunch of goblins right in front of him. He was ready to fight. Rather, Bjorn explained that the warrior's heart he possessed was twitching. He looked down at his chest, feeling the power building up inside him. He could barely contain himself. Bjorn's heart started to glow red, pulsing with energy. It felt like it was about to explode out of his chest. He was getting excited to fight. Bjorn screamed as he charged forward, ready to smash the goblins. He swung his weapon with all his might. He wanted to crush them. The goblins went flying as Bjorn's weapon hit them. They were no match for his strength. The force of the blow sent them crashing into the trees. Bjorn slammed his shield forward with incredible force. The impact sent a shockwave through the air. He was going all out against these goblins. Goblins flew through the air after getting hit, but more goblins were coming at him from every direction. They were attacking from both sides, trying to overwhelm him. Bjorn roared as he swung his weapon again, hitting more goblins. His eyes glowed with a fierce intensity. The warrior was not backing down. Bjorn smashed another goblin with his shield. The sound of the impact echoed through the forest. He was determined to take them all down. Bjorn's eyes narrowed, focusing on the next target. He was breathing heavily, but his determination didn't waver. The young man was ready for whatever came next. The blow landed with savage force. The impact sent blood and debris flying everywhere. It was a near thing. The attack was so close, it was terrifying. And immediately after, the warrior's eyes widened in shock. He grunted with effort. It was a struggle to keep fighting. A goblin was about to feel the full force of his axe. The strike was coming down fast. Bjorn stood tall, breathing heavily. He realized that was way too close for comfort. The young man muttered that his head would have gone flying if he had reacted a second slower. Bjorn was surrounded by goblins and didn't even have time to catch his breath. He thought that even if they were normal goblins, more than 5 was pretty scary. He figured he would just have to put up with being injured. It was unavoidable, but that was only if he was alone. He knew he wasn't. Bjorn swung his weapon, and the goblins went flying. He was ready to take on all of them. Erwin looked relieved. She had been worried about the fight. Bjorn noticed that Erwin had gotten back into position. He thought he would finish things off. He was ready to take on whatever came next. Bjorn looked absolutely furious. He called those goblins a bunch of bastards. He was tired of dealing with them. Bjorn challenged them, shouting for them to come at him. The warrior was ready to take on the whole group. He wasn't scared at all.